For context, my grandparents got this big suburban house in the 80s for a really low price and decided to build a pool on the second floor to it and whatnot. When I say the house was big, I mean it was big. A large basement with wine cellar, 2 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, an office, 2 living rooms, huge kitchen/dining room and a pool house/bar on the first floor. 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, a balcony terrace, and a living/dining room on the second floor. My family moved in when the construction was still going on, and weird-ass things started to happen. Like a drill going max power being unplugged, or things disappearing and appearing again in strange and odd places. But my family would always joke about the house being haunted, and never really did anything about it. At some point, it got pretty insane, and my grandpa took a bottle of holy water, and that was it. Ever since I remember, I've had this strange, uneasy feeling about the house, and particularly about some rooms within it, like I was never alone and was being watched, but I always brushed it off, thinking that I was just being a silly girl. At some point, I got to completely avoid going into these places. I was maybe 3 or 4 when I had this dream. I was playing at the bottom of the stairs and some shadowy figures started growing from the floor. I remember I was just watching it slowly materialize itself in front of me, until it looked like a man with a hat and evil eyes, all black. A few years ago, researching over the web, I realized it was a shadow man. He had his hands stretched over towards me and was about to say something when I woke up, shaken and scared to death. I sometimes saw this figure standing on the hallway, so I avoided going there by myself as much as I could. When I was 7, I moved to the room besides the stairs on the second floor. This is one of the rooms that made me feel uneasy. I would always find my stuff misplaced around my room, and my lamps and radio unplugged, but I didn't really pay attention to it. Staying in this room, my nightmares and creepy dreams intensified. I remember clearly waking up starving pretty early on a Sunday morning, and when I tried to get up, I fell into a void and woke up really scared. When I finally stopped shaking, I tried to get up again just to end up going into the void once more. This went on 5 times, and I was so scared that I eventually stopped trying to get up until my mum went to wake me up a few hours later. Another time, I was sitting in the kitchen with my grandma late one night. Everyone else was asleep, and we were chatting about life when she sewed some pillows for the sofa. When she was done, she piled the pillows over a counter where there were 4 of them, and made some tea for us to keep talking. We were laughing and everything, when all of a sudden the pillows flew across the kitchen, as if they were angrily tossed and crushed at the laundry room door, which was above the basement. Another room that freaked me out. When I was 11 years old, and it was about 11 p.m. on a school night, I turned off all the lights and went to bed. Just a few minutes passed, so there wasn't a real chance that I was dreaming when I heard a rhythmic tapping on my window. It was soft at first and then a bit louder. Keep in mind, this was upstairs. I slowly turned around to the window, and through the curtains I saw this rather tall and lean humanoid figure with a long, thin head and a 3-fingered hand tapping on my window. I screamed at the top of my lungs and ran to my mum's bedroom. I remember she checked my room and everything was normal, so my grandpa and uncle checked the whole yard and found nothing. I obviously didn't sleep that night and stayed in my mum's room for at least a week. After that episode, I switched bedrooms. My new room had a walk-in closet where my grandma kept the towels, sheets, and some really old stuff that we never used, so its door was mainly closed. The door had a latch on the outside that was impossible to open from the inside of the closet. One afternoon when I was about 14, I was heading home alone, playing video games after school when I heard this loud bang coming from the closet. I immediately froze and looked at the door. Then it started to sound as if someone was desperately trying to take down the door, so I noped my way downstairs and waited for my mum. One afternoon when I was 15, I came back from school starving, as only a teen would, so I went directly to the kitchen. As far as I knew, I was alone. When I was almost done fixing myself a sandwich, I hear a loud bang upstairs and almost immediately heard my mum scream in absolute terror. So I obviously ran upstairs to check on her. We caught each other on the stairs. She was pale as ever and shaking, so I took her down to calm her down. As soon as she could speak to me again, she said she was watching TV in her room when she heard the same noise I heard. She startled and looked at the window and saw the shadow man floating outside her window, hence her scream and the running downstairs. We ended up leaving that house about 17 years ago. I still remember a couple nightmares I had back then regarding the house, and even now sometimes in my dreams, I still feel that house, and those feelings return. It creeps me out. My dad's house is definitely what you would think of as haunted. The whole place has since had a nasty vibe, even when you're simply in another room with nobody else there, and it's unbearable on your own. This experience happened to me when I was a teenager, and it was my first one. What I find interesting is that it was just a completely normal night. I hadn't been spooking myself out with movies, games, or stories. I was just chilling out with my dad in the back room. Next to the back room is the front room, in which there is a door in the corner which leads immediately to the staircase. The front room was completely empty at the time. I was just playing on my computer next to my dad when I heard my mom call me from upstairs, where she was tucking my toddler sister into bed. I got up from my chair, opened the door into the front room, and took a step inside. What happened then is difficult to describe. It was like I'd been separated from the rest of the house. I can't remember if the light was on or off, but it was bright enough to get a clear image of what I saw. In the corner, blocking my way to the stairs, was a female figure. She was sitting with her arms folded around her knees, and her forehead on her knees, blocking her face. She looked filthy, with matted dark brown hair, and her skin looked mottled. She was wearing one of those light blue hospital gowns with the dashed pattern. I couldn't tell her age. I froze in my step and took in the sight. It was so real. She wasn't at all transparent and made of smoke or anything like that. She was completely solid, and the light fell on her as if it would any real person. The worst part was that there was this most evil, malicious, deadly feeling of primal finality emanating from this thing. Her face was hidden, but I could tell she was smiling. I knew she was grinning at me like I was a mouse in a trap. I took a few more steps forwards to get a closer look, until I felt like that if I took one more step, it would be the end of me. I didn't know how long I stood staring. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few seconds. Eventually my body and mind started working together again, and I sprinted out of the room screaming. My dad was trying to figure out what was wrong, but I was incoherent. I heard my mum stampeding down the stairs, and when she came I started getting angrier at her, thinking she had somehow pranked me. I don't think my brain could handle what I saw, so I began trying to rationalize it in possible ways. I feel like I saw something that I shouldn't have, or that the thing showed itself to me on purpose. Ever since then, I've always felt her presence in the house, and general activity increased. As though seeing one thing opened the door to many other experiences. The dogs always stare, bark, growl, and raise their hackles at that exact corner whenever we use the room in the winter. I would like to note that I've never hallucinated in waking before or after. I've had sleep paralysis a few times later on, but it was a completely different experience. I wish I could believe it was just a hallucination. I've had people tell me that the story sounds cliché because she was in a hospital gown, but I'm not going to change what actually happened to make it more original nor believable. This has haunted me for years, and I doubt I'll ever forget it. All the other experiences I've had, including some with witnesses.
I really wish I could just forget though, because even now in my mid-20s, I still feel the fear when I'm alone in the dark. I know there are things out there that science doesn't have a means to explain yet, and I'd imagine that this is one of them.
I want to start off by saying I really don't consider myself a heavy believer in the paranormal. I feel that a lot of situations can be explained by logical science. There are some things that simply cannot be explained though. There were 3 incidences in my childhood home that I cannot still explain to this day. If someone has experienced anything similar, feel free to give me insight. Let me take you back to when I was younger, perhaps 10 or 11. We lived in a very large old Victorian house, which had 5 floors, very long hallways on each floor, and old wooden flooring. There were always creepy sounds at night, and weird power outages, but that could always be attributed to the age of the house. We liked the house a lot. The first incident happened in the attic. We called it the attic, but in reality, it had a family room, a bathroom, a kitchen, and a guest room. The 3rd floor stairs have a landing that leads to the attic door, which takes you up a flight of stairs, and you come to a long hallway on your left that leads you to the family room at the end of the hall, and a large window on your right that the moonlight comes through. When you enter the family room, there's a spiral staircase that takes you to the top floor, which is just a dark, small room that we never used except for storage. One night, I was playing with my toys on the stairs of the 3rd floor, right next to the door that leads to the attic. We had a cat at the time. As I was playing, I heard scratching in the attic. Not wanting to get in trouble for her destroying a couch, as I'm the one who asked for the cat, I opened the attic door and walked up the stairs to go find her. As soon as I reached the top of the stairs and turned down the long hallway, the scratching stopped and the power to the house went out, which left me in total darkness. I put my back against the window and slid down, and started down the long hallway, terrified and waiting for the power to come on. As I slid down, I heard a very slow thump, the sound of someone walking down the spiral staircase. The sound is unmistakable because the steps are metal. The sound continued right behind the family room door. I heard each step. The steps stopped. The family room door moved slightly, and immediately I felt this rush come over me. I got so cold, and my heart started beating in such a way, I felt it actually move my chest. After a few seconds, the door bolted open, and something started sprinting down the hallway at me. I couldn't see a thing, but I felt the movement, that feeling you get when something is near you. I remember that was the first time I ever felt like prey. My heart was in my throat, but I screamed as loudly as I could, and as soon as it got close to me, the rush went away, and the cold left my body. My parents ran up the stairs, and after I told them what happened, they went to the breaker box and came up and looked all around but found nothing. But the handle on the family room door was broken, and the window behind me was cracked. It is possible I cracked it when I put my back into it to slide down, but it was cracked at a height that I couldn't reach with my body at the time. The basement was the worst part of the house. It was one of those dreary, unfinished concrete floor basements. It was as large as any first floor of a house. I mean truly massive. When you open the door, the short stairs look like you're going into a cellar. And when you come down the stairs, you have to walk for several steps in the dark to find the string of light and pull it. Even then, that light only illuminates the immediate area, not the rest of the basement. There are several lights like this the further you go, each one with a string to pull. To the left is the rest of the basement. It goes all the way back, and then there's a cove tucked to the left where the dogs sleep. It's out of the line of sight. Since there's a small window in the cove, it casts this bluish-black light in the morning and night from the moon. One early morning around 5 a.m. I had to go feed the dogs since my dad was out of town. I hated when it was my turn because the basement always gave me a terrible feeling. I would always call the dogs to meet me at the stairs so that I didn't have to walk down the stairs in the dark alone. I called for them, waited and called again. They didn't come and I heard no sound, so I walked down the stairs in the dark and held my hand out to find the string to pull the light. As I reached for the light, I saw movement at the end of the basement near the cove, and my breath caught in my chest. I pulled the light fast, and the bulb popped with a quick burst of light. In that moment I saw a man standing at the end of the basement. He didn't disappear like in the movies though, and I wish he had. In the dark he was a sliver of moonlight from the cove window. I can still see him standing there with his back to me. He didn't move at all, and his head was cocked to the left in such an unnatural way, at an angle where his neck had to have been broken. He was probably 40 feet away from me. As I stood there trying to force a scream through my throat that felt like it was locked up, I couldn't look away. And in those few seconds I stared, I saw it. It was less of a man and more of a thing. It had white translucent skin and looked gangly. I literally and honestly pissed myself standing up. I lost all control. I think the pee snapped out of me because I felt the warmth of my leg, and I started backing away. And as I backed away, it sprinted to the left towards the cove where the dogs were, and I ran up those stairs, and I chipped my tooth falling into the stairs, still chipped to this day, and I slammed the door shut and locked the latch. I called my mum down, and we called the dogs from the top of the stairs. No response. We went down there, and both dogs were huddled together in the corner of the cove. It took them 5 minutes to leave the corner and come up. We had to pull them apart and walk them with us holding their collars. The last one is short and simple, and probably the worst experience I had in that house. In that same basement, there's a furnace room to the left of the stairs about 15 feet away from the stairs. It's dark and cramped, and has all kinds of luggage and extra supplies in it. The day before Thanksgiving, we were preparing for family to arrive. My mother sent me to get the Thanksgiving table decor, or whatever it's called, and as I walked down the stairs I saw the furnace room door was cracked. I stopped dead in my tracks. That door was never left open. We were always told to close it so that the dogs don't go in there. Really, my parents made a huge deal out of it, and I stayed on the stairs and stared at the door. I felt the hair on my neck raise, and my fists clench out of instinct. As I stare in the crack of the door, I see half a smile in one eye. The smile was so close to being human, but so far at the same time. I can't explain it. It was as though something had been observing humans to mimic them, but just couldn't get the face right. As I ran up the stairs, I heard the creak of the furnace door opening further, slammed, and locked the door. And that was the last time I ever went into the basement. From that point on, my parents never made me go back down there and delegated my basement chores to my siblings, even though I know that they don't believe me. It was a nice gesture, and I was thankful for it. Since we moved, I have never experienced anything abnormal in our house. I'm 26 now, and have never had any issues with the paranormal since then. I like to rationalize by telling myself it was fear and my brain playing tricks on me. But part of me deep down knows that it wasn't. I feel like I'm going crazy, but I think my house might be haunted. Let me give you some background. Midwest, USA. I think it was all a wooded area a long time ago, but my great-grandparents built a house. Additions were added. I think they both just died of old age, but I'm not sure. But they gave the house to my dad when he was younger, married my mum, had me and my brother, who's 5 years younger, tore down the house that was here before, and built the house that we're currently living in. That was 15 years ago. I don't know that much about my great-grandparents. Great-grandpa died before I was born, and great-grandma died before I was in school. But my parents had a rough marriage. They fought a lot, and I remember getting bad enough that I would get kicked out of the house and go next door to my aunts. They both did things to each other that were not cool, and of course my brother and I got caught in the middle. They eventually divorced, Mum left, Dad met someone who moved in right away with her daughter. But apparently the daughter, who was 2 years younger than me, would try to summon demons and talk to spirits. She allegedly even tried turning the neighbor girl into a werewolf once, but that's a story for another day. Well, I was close with her mum, my dad's girlfriend. I struggled with mental illness and still do, but she helped me through a lot of it. In my freshman year of college, she ended her life within the house. A month later, Dad met someone again. They got married a year later. 2 years after that, and we're in the present day, and they are in the process of getting a divorce. But now that you've got the backstory, let me get into the experiences. My first night back from my first year of college, all my crap was in my room and on my bed. So where do I sleep? In the living room on the couch? At the time I had 2 cats, and there was, and still is, a rocking chair that the ex-girlfriend would occasionally sit and rock in. Well, I was laying on the couch trying to sleep. One cat would be sleeping on my chest, and the other would sleep on the floor next to me. And I heard the chair start creaking, like someone in it was rocking. I didn't feel threatened or anything, but I felt spooked the hell out, and thought I was going crazy. I've been home for almost 2 months now since I graduated college. Dad and his wife were fighting, and she left about 3 weeks ago. After she left, I noticed something happen. We have a 2-story house. When I would be downstairs alone, the chandelier above the table would have a light that would flicker off when I wasn't looking, but come back on when I would look at it. Sometimes I would turn my head fast enough to catch it coming back on, and this happened several times. I didn't have to be home alone for it to happen, but I had to be the only person downstairs. My house also just felt off. I don't know how to describe it, but I always got these bad vibes. Even my fiancée feels it, and notices it when she's over. It just doesn't feel like home. This next part isn't my experience, but apparently things would be moved around in a manner that my great-granddad, my dad's grandma, would move things in a way only she would. The ex felt that the house was haunted 2 years ago. She and I had a conversation about it, and that's how I heard about the things being moved. So I think back to the problem, reflecting on it. I think the problem was that my parents fought a lot. It was bad, malicious, a lot of resentment, but they tried staying together for the kids, which didn't work out well. I've struggled with depression since I was a child, and I've had lots of dark and morbid thoughts. Dad and his ex fought a lot too. Dad and his soon-to-be ex-wife fight a lot. The house just feels like a void of maliciousness, anger and resentment. A black hole that sucks out all things positive. Maybe something has caused this. Perhaps it was already here and we've only made it worse. I think the shenanigans the daughter did, certainly, didn't make matters any better. As for the light, as of now I can't think of anything besides the bad bulb that was somehow in sync with me, but I don't think anyone's changed it. What can I do? Do I have any options? I don't know where to go, where to start. All replies are welcome and appreciated. Oh, and I just remembered. The other neighbor's kid. The neighborhood kids aren't the right term as they live out in the middle of nowhere, but that's the closest thing I can call them, had several experiences with the ditch that runs on my family's property, but on the opposite side of the road. On our side, my aunt had a friend that was a medium. A long time ago, she said she saw something on her side of the ditch that runs between my and her house, and it was described as my great-grandpa digging roughly where there's a big rut that will mess you up on an ATV if you're driving on that back road. I don't know if the friend is still in the area. I think she moved. Nonetheless, all of these things really do scare me. In 2003, I lived in the southwestern part of Virginia, in the US, in a small mountain town. The town had been a coal mining town for generations and had been around since the 1800s. After living in the basement of my girlfriend's mother's house for over a year, we decided it was time to get our own place. The place we had chose to rent happened to be the second home we looked at. It was a 2-story brick home that had been around for well over 100 years. It was conveniently located across the street from a bank, restaurant, and grocery store. The current owners had remodeled the home to have an apartment on the ground floor and another on the upper floor. The apartment we chose was the ground floor apartment, and although it was $50 more a month, we didn't mind. We signed a 1-year lease and moved in. As we settled into our new home, things couldn't have been better. No one lived in there in the other apartment, and it was incredibly peaceful considering its location. For the first month, things were normal aside from the small little creaks and noises that were associated with the noises of an old home. One night, things changed, as fast as the flip of a coin. Sitting in our living room and watching TV, we began to hear defined footsteps walking around in the upstairs apartment. At first, I thought that someone must be moving in upstairs, and we both got excited to see who our new neighbors were. We decided we should go sit on our shared front porch and wait for an opportunity to introduce ourselves. After an hour or two, we gave up and went inside and bedded down for the night. For the next week, we continued to hear someone walking around but never saw our new neighbors. At this time, I worked a job that had me working various different shifts. One particular night, I got home and my girlfriend asked if I could maybe talk to our neighbor about all the noise we were hearing. I obliged and went to knock on the door. After knocking a few times, no one answered and I gave up. I stepped out front for a cigarette and had a realization that I never saw a moving truck and no new vehicle was parked out front. And perhaps even more strange, the lights in the apartment never appeared on at night. At the end of the second month, as I dropped off my rent to the landlord, I asked about our new neighbors and was told the apartment hadn't been rented yet. I told our landlord about the noises. He said that wild animals must have gotten in somehow and he would stop by and look at the situation. He came by on a Saturday and we looked around the empty upstairs apartment and couldn't find a sign of anything. He told me it must be the noise of an old house, and I just had to accept that. I knew there had to be more going on, but I saw for myself that nothing could be making those noises. Life continued, and so did the footsteps. A few weeks later, we had some friends over for dinner, when the footsteps started again. My best friend started to remark about how loud our neighbors were, and I filled him in on what was going on. He was convinced that someone must be breaking into that apartment at night. With a little bit of liquid courage, we found a creative way to get the door open and went in to inspect. Once again, the apartment was empty, and I was at a loss. We locked up the vacant apartment, and that is when the conversation came up about the house possibly being haunted. And this was something that we would just have to accept. This conversation went on for a few hours between myself and girlfriend and our two best friends. In retrospect, I wish this conversation and exploration never happened, as the following day everything got worse. Our friends got up the next day and headed home. We decided to walk across the street to the grocery store and spent the next hour shopping. Upon returning home, we unlocked the door and walked into our apartment to discover every door and cabinet in the house standing wide open. This sent chills up my spine. From this point forward, we had a routine of checking everything before we left home. Every time we came home, everything was wrong. We experienced doors being opened that were closed, and lights or fans would turn on or off on their own. This wasn't an electrical issue, as the switches themselves would be flipped. The more that this happened, the more concerned we became. But we were under a lease, and although the events were strange, it didn't seem malicious. So, we stayed. As days went on, it escalated. One evening I was sitting in our spare bedroom, which is where our computer is located. My girlfriend comes walking in and asks what I need. Me being confused by this, I ask what she means, and she says she heard me call her name. I told her that I had not called for her, and she accused me of trying to prank or scare her. The following night, I'm back in the spare bedroom, and I hear her call my name. I got up and went to see what she needed. She hadn't called me and again accused me of trying to scare her. At this point, I'm starting to get really concerned, as disembodied voices can't be a good thing. This continued for a long time as we lived there, and it got to the point that my girlfriend would say my name and I would ignore her, as I thought it wouldn't be her at first. For most, this probably would have been enough, but yet we stayed. After about 4 months of living there, we received a knock at the door. I answered and was greeted by a nice lady that was around the same age as myself and my girlfriend. She stated that she had lived there before the remodeling, and how much nicer the apartment looks. We agreed that it was nice, but asked her if she ever experienced anything odd while living there. She quite frankly said, "Oh, you mean the ghosts?" Yes. We were talking about ghosts. She stated that the house was definitely haunted, and she used to contact the ghosts on a Ouija board when she lived there. Then she asks if we would be willing to move into the upstairs apartment and let her have our apartment, as she wanted to move back to the home, but couldn't handle the stairs due to her being pregnant. I politely declined, as my girlfriend was partially disabled after a car accident, and we chose this apartment specifically due to that. I could tell the girl was disappointed in hearing this, but she was cordial and gave us her number in case we changed our minds, or if we decided to move, so that we could let her know. For the next month, things continued. They didn't escalate, but didn't get better either. At this time, the girl who appeared in our door a month ago was back, and she informed us that she was moving into the upstairs apartment and appealed to us again to switch apartment. We politely declined. She proceeded to move in. For the next month, things seemed to be getting better. Neither of us heard the voices, the issues with the doors and lights stopped, and any footsteps upstairs could now be justified. Just as we got used to normal life in the house, the activity started again. But now it was worse than ever. Now we had to deal with all the issues from before, and now new things were happening too. At times, you would feel breathing on the back of your neck, only for no one to be behind you. We started seeing shadows move out of the corner of our eyes, and began to have issues with light bulbs burning out prematurely, and batteries in devices draining at an unexplainable rate. At this point, we had less than 6 months left on our lease, and decided that we were moving when our lease ended. The experience we had in this apartment had put a massive strain on our relationship. At this point in time, my girlfriend was doing everything in her power to not stay in the house alone while I was working. On multiple occasions, she went to her mum's house and stayed there for days at a time. Every time she stayed at her mum's, she asked me to stay with her instead of staying in the house alone, but that would have added an hour to my commute each day. I would be lying if I said I wasn't scared, but I did it anyway. One morning I woke up after a long and mostly sleepless night. As I lay in bed trying to wake up, I hear footsteps in my apartment, and I know that I'm home alone. As I quietly get out of bed, I see my girlfriend walk past the bedroom door. This surprised me, as I didn't expect her to be there. I get up and walk in to find out what she is doing home, and realize that she isn't there. I frantically call her and explain that I just saw her in the apartment. She tries to calm me down, but explains that it wasn't her, as she was still at her mum's house over half-hour away. Now I am scared and feeling alone. I decided this was too much and appealed to my girlfriend to please come and stay with me. I wouldn't have the strength to do it alone. She declined and said that the ghosts and/or demons don't care about numbers, and to deal with my stress I turned to smoking weed so that I could relax. But it didn't relax me at all. If anything, it only elevated my anxiety. It did, however, help me sleep, so I made it a routine before going to bed. One night, the guy who I used to buy my green off stopped by to drop some off. I gave him my address and told him to knock when he got out there. Instead of getting a knock on the door, I get a phone call from him. He says that he's out front, and that I shouldn't be sitting at home alone, and I should come hang out with him for a while. I agree and head out the door to meet him, get in his car, and as we pull away, he tells me to move out of that place now. I of course asked him why, and he said that if he told me everything he knew about that place, I would never step foot in there again. I pushed for more, but he wouldn't tell me. I am now truly terrified, but also curious as to what happened in the house. At this point, I had 2 months left on the lease. I'm spending every night online looking for info about the house, and one night a guy I work with came by to help me search. I was amazed how much he helped me discover in such a short period of time. We found the age of the house, a picture of the home that was so old the main street in front of my house wasn't a road but instead a railroad track. We also found a news article talking about a fire in the house and the death of the occupant during the fire. Once we found this article and started to read it, we both began to hear the voices of what sounded like 10 kids playing on my front porch. I jumped up to look to see what was going on, and the moment I opened the front door, the noise stopped, and obviously, there was no one there. My friend from work was so freaked out by this he left immediately, and refused to ever step foot in the house again. At this point, I am now volunteering for overtime, just so that I don't have to be home. One day I came home to find a moving truck sitting out front, and my upstairs neighbor was moving out, as the stairs were adding complications to her pregnancy. She informed me her mother would be by the following day to pick up the last few items that were left. This night was strange, due to how peaceful everything suddenly became. No noise, no voices, nothing. That had to be the best night's sleep I'd had in ages. The following day comes and I'm outside mowing the lawn when the mother of the other tenant arrives. I'm greeted by her and we talk briefly about her daughter and the soon-to-be baby. After a few moments we parted ways and she went inside to gather the rest of her daughter's belongings. I offered to help, but she declined, so I decided to stick close by just in case. After 2 trips to her car, she looked at me and stated that she only had a few pillows left to load up, and how she couldn't wait to walk out of that creepy house for the final time. We had conversations previously about the haunting, you see. About 2 minutes after she went inside, I heard a scream and the sound of something tumbling down the steps. I went to investigate. The mother had apparently fallen down the steps. As I went to help her, she asked me to get her away from the house and said something forcefully pushed her down the steps. I helped her to the car, and she asked if I could grab the pillows that she dropped as she fell. She stated that if I didn't feel comfortable, that they could just stay behind. Attempting to be Mr. Macho Man, I told her I'd get them for her and proceeded back in. I reached the top of the stairs, grabbed the pillows and ran back down, and I slammed the door closed and returned to the mother. She was visibly shaken and had a bruise appearing, and I asked if she wanted to go to the hospital, but she declined, and asked if I would drive her and her car home. She said that she would have her husband bring me back. I knew she was in no shape to drive, so agreed, and after a short 10-minute journey I dropped her off, and her husband returned me to the house. Now I really am alone in the house, and I know it can hurt people. That night before I went to bed, I stepped out on the front porch for a cigarette. As I go back inside, I notice the door to the upstairs apartment is standing wide open. One half of me wanted me to just pull the door closed, while the other half of me thought I needed to make sure no one was up there. I knew that I had closed the door earlier, and I feel like, if it had been open, that I would have noticed during one of my many times outside that evening. Ultimately, I decided to go upstairs and check everything out. As soon as I arrived at the top of the stairs, I hear an unnatural voice say, "Leave." I ran down the stairs as fast as humanly possible, locked the door to the upstairs apartment and returned to my apartment more scared than I have ever been. After tossing and turning for several hours, I finally managed to fall asleep. When I awoke the next day, my front door was standing wide open. I had 2 locks, one on the doorknob and a deadbolt that could only be operated from the inside of the apartment. Both locks were in the locked position, yet the door was standing wide open. I'm losing my mind at this point. Having around 5 weeks left on the lease, I don't feel safe here at all. I know I'm not spending an entire day in the house alone, so I decided to shower and get ready to leave for the day. When I turned the water on, nothing happened though. I called the landlord, as water was included in the rent. I went to the back porch to call him while I smoked and realized that the stairwell going into the basement is filled with water. I called the landlord and he states he's out of town and that he keeps a key to the basement hidden in each of the apartments in case of emergency. I get the key, shut off the water to the house, and while doing so realized that a plastic or PVC pipe had broken. I knew I could fix it, so I offered to do so. The hour that I spent in that basement was horrible. Nothing happened while down there, but I was totally creeped out. I got a very strange feeling that I was being watched, or that something was going to jump out and attack me. I finished the job, and finally got my shower. I decided to go to my girlfriend's mum's house for the night as I was far too stressed. The following day after I got off work, I went back to the apartment with a realization that I only have a month left in that place. I had dinner that night, sat down and watched TV, and in the middle of my show my TV went black. Then it flashed white, then it all went black. All for the letters D-I-E. This lasted for about 5 seconds and the TV powered off on its own, and then would not switch back on. The following day I dropped the TV off at a repair shop on my way back to work. The TV was just a little over a year old, and after I got off I swung by the repair shop and was informed they couldn't find anything technically wrong with it, but that it wouldn't power on. This was the final straw. The following day I went to the bank and applied for a small home loan that was approved. I only entered that apartment one more time, the day I moved out. The experiences I had there have stuck with me, and although I have lived in many different places in my life, no place sticks in my mind like that one does. I feel lucky that I was never physically hurt, but the mental toll of something like this can stick with you forever. My parents bought their first house back in 1972. It was a fixer-upper, but they decided to move in right away and fix things when time and money permitted. Within a few days of moving there, the new neighbors came over to introduce themselves. They also let my parents know that the previous owners had moved out after a nasty divorce. They had lost their second child to SIDS, and their relationship went downhill from there. My parents were horrified, more so because they were newly pregnant and couldn't imagine going through such a thing. They eventually pretty much forgot all about it. Life went on, and they were in love with their new life and their new house. In preparation for the baby, they decided to wallpaper the nursery. Now my dad told my mum there was no need in wallpapering the inside of the closet, but she insisted. She was kneeling down, scraping off old paint inside the closet when her eyes fell upon something that made her blood turn to ice. Written in crayon, about the eye level for a kindergartner, in childish scrawl was written, "I killed the baby." These strange encounters happened back when I was 6 to 8 years old and lived in a small, mostly unheard of town in Maryland. I'm now 17 and live in England. Back then I lived in this town, as did my mum's older sister and my older cousins, and in both of our houses we had odd encounters. This is the first time I remember something strange happening. The year was 2011, and me and my older cousin Johnny were playing around in his room with the rest of our family down in the kitchen. His room kind of has a strange setup. It is connected to the laundry room and has a door that leads straight to the attic. I can remember me and him teasing my younger sister, who wanted to play his recorder but not letting her have it. At this point, my little sister gave up and walked away from us, and that's when me and him decided it would be funny to throw the recorder in the attic. We were both standing side by side in front of the steps, with the door open when he threw it as hard as he could up the steps. Me and him were laughing when we paused and saw the recorder had stopped when it reached the attic.
It floated for a few seconds, then launched straight towards us at a faster speed than what we threw it up. I immediately jumped out of the doorway and he backed against the wall as it flew to the bottom step and snapped in half. We both looked at each other terrified and ran down to the kitchen to tell our family what happened. Everyone just laughed except for my mother, who is really into the paranormal and has had some experiences in the house herself. The next encounter I can't quite place, but I remember I was very sick, and it could have just been a fever dream, but the strange thing is, I only ever hallucinated when I was sick in that house, and have never had anything happen since, but I'll leave it up to you guys to decide. It's important to state that when I was little I had a huge fear of whispering. Don't ask me why, as I can't tell you. I was on my tablet watching Looney Tune episodes. That's when I started to hear a lot of it. I say a lot of whispering because it sounded like at least 8 people were whispering my name and other audible things. I got terrified and turned all the lights off for whatever reason and hid under my covers until I fell asleep. This last encounter took place at night during the summer of 2012. I was asleep and started to wake up. As I looked around, I realized it was pitch dark outside, aside from the street lights giving some brightness in my room. I looked down and realized I was sitting straight up, cross-legged, and my hands were moving, making weird symbols. When I looked ahead of me, I saw a little boy sitting on a few storage bins in my room doing the same hand symbols. As soon as I realized what was going on, I passed back out. Those are my stories, and I wish I had some explanations for them.
Back in 2005, my husband and I moved into our new home, and we were so happy. It was a 3-bedroom attached with a front and back garden, and literally a stone's throw away from my family. It was perfect. Doing the house up was amazing, and I loved putting our stamp on it, making it our home, and hopefully one day having a baby, and completing our perfect family. With both of us working full-time, we pretty much kept to ourselves, and didn't really know any of our neighbors. But as the months went on, we eventually got to know the lady to the right of us, and we ended up becoming really friendly with her for the next 12 years of our time in that house. She was older, and in the winter we would offer to get her shopping, etc., and would always keep an eye on her. The neighbors to the left, though, were a completely different story. They seemed nice and would always say hi when we saw them, and were a bit older than my husband and I. But boy did they like to argue. Every Friday night the music would start around 7 p.m, and by the time 11 p.m. came around, we would hear them arguing, and it would get louder and louder, and usually stop at around 1 a.m. Saturday night would then come around, and the cycle would start all over again. It didn't bother us, and it didn't really get to the stage where we would call the police. It was just a drunk couple arguing over something trivial, which would be forgotten in the morning, as always, and as loved up the next day whenever we saw them. They didn't even seem embarrassed, but each to their own, I guess. After a while it came to the stage where we would time when they would start arguing, and have bets when they would kick off. This went on for about a year, and that's when everything changed, and the most hellish night of our lives was about to happen. Life went on as normal. The arguing continued, and a year later we were blessed with a beautiful baby boy. We were so excited. My perfect family was now complete, and we couldn't be happier. One beautiful spring night, my husband and I were tired, and decided to get cozy in bed with the baby and watch TV. It was a Sunday night, so we knew there wouldn't be any issues from the neighbors. But we were very wrong. To let you know the layout of our house, our bedroom windows look straight out into our front garden. We can also see our neighbor's garden, all the way down to the bottom of his path, just because the window is situated more to his side. We also have a huge grass verge in front of the row of houses with a small hill on it, which people use to cut through or walk their dogs. Just as I got the baby to sleep, we heard the neighbor coming out of his path and shouting at someone on the grass. Just as I got the baby to sleep, we heard the neighbor coming out into his path and shouting at someone on the grass at the verge. My husband and I both look at each other thinking, this is Sunday. What are they up to now? We turned the TV down and listened to what was happening, but the voices were too quiet to hear. We went back to watching TV, and about 5 minutes later we heard a scuffle, a thud, and then the sound of someone running. Seconds later the neighbor's girlfriend came out, and we heard the most blood-curdling scream. We rushed to the window, and there was my neighbor's girlfriend cradling his body, lifeless, in her arms by the path. We were in absolute shock. I started crying. My husband closed the blinds and told me not to look out the window again. The emergency services arrived pretty much straight away, and a forensics team was soon on the scene. The police came to our door and asked if we heard anything, but in all honesty, we knew what they were like, so we didn't pay that much attention till we heard the screaming. We eventually found out our neighbor had died of his injuries as soon as the street was cordoned off and police were everywhere. It was later found out he had owed someone money, and when he couldn't pay up, the guy hit him over the head with a brick, killing him instantly. It was the most horrific night of our lives, seeing that poor man laying there like that, and then finding out he was actually dead. It was horrible. That girl's scream will live with me forever. Life had to go on. Unfortunately, and eventually, the house went up for sale. Through town gossip, we heard she put the house up for sale as she couldn't cope living in the house her boyfriend died in, and soon new people moved in. The new neighbors were lovely, and like us, they kept to themselves. Our weekend became quiet, but I don't think we'll ever get over what happened to that poor man. Roll on 2 years. It was a cold and dark winter morning. My husband was leaving early for work and put my son in bed beside me to get cozy. About an hour later, I was waking up from my sleep as I could hear my son giggling. I thought I was still dreaming, but as I came, his giggle got louder. I looked over at him, and there he was giggling away, looking over at the bedroom window. I thought, what's he looking at? I couldn't see anything, and I thought, is there a breeze moving the blinds? And he's laughing at them moving? Eventually, I asked, what are you laughing at, darling? What he said next made me tremble. The man at the window, as if it was an everyday occurrence. I laughed with nerves. What man? And my son, without missing a beat, replied, the funny man at the window, and continued to giggle. I was frozen with fear. When you watch horror movies as much as I do, your mind works overtime. I didn't know what to do. He kept giggling as if someone was just making funny faces at him or something. After about 5 minutes of lying there, thinking what the hell, I finally plucked up the courage to pick him up and take him downstairs to the living room. The whole time I was down the stairs, I tried to act normal for my son's sake, but I kept looking up the stairs as if something or someone was going to walk down them. I was petrified. As soon as the sun came up, I ventured back up the stairs, opened all the blinds to let the light in, and both of us got dressed and went out for the day. When my husband got home, I told him all about it, but he thinks that he must just have a wild imagination. Every morning through that winter I was dreading my husband leaving for work, but nothing like that ever happened again. My son is 15 now. On the odd occasion when I mention it to him, he can't remember. Could it have been my dead neighbor, making my son laugh all those years ago? He never had a chance to meet him after all. Perhaps it was his way of saying hello. What do you all think? From the time I was born until I was around 6 years old, my family and I lived in a townhome close to my city's community college. It wasn't particularly old, and as far as my parents knew, the house had no dark past to speak of. There was a good chance the house was built on old farmland, and there was certainly a Native American presence in the area long ago. But the house itself was totally normal. My parents moved into the house in 2001 and hadn't had anything out of the ordinary occur until I was born, sometime around late 2004 to early 2005. This is the first odd experience my family had in the house, as told to me by my mum. My mum was very close friends with her supervisor, Christy. Christy was over at our house quite often, since my mum often consulted her for help with work, and she would usually bring her son over to play with me. On this particular day, it was just her. My mum and Christy were down in the kitchen talking at the table. My dad was upstairs in one of the bedrooms changing my diaper. My mum goes up to use the bathroom, which was just across the hall from the kitchen by the front door, and Christy stays at the table. As my mum is in the bathroom, out of nowhere she hears a woman's voice she doesn't recognize, saying something along the lines of, "Hello, handsome." My mum, thinking a neighbor has come over to say hello, thinks nothing of it, and when she comes out of the bathroom, she asks Christy if anyone's come over. Christy looks at my mum baffled and tells her that no one has entered the house and that she hadn't heard a woman's voice. As Christy and my mum look around the house puzzled, my dad comes downstairs holding me and asks, "Who stopped by to say hello?" He'd heard the same woman's voice. No one could figure out where the voice had come from, or how both my mum and dad, on 2 separate floors at the time, had both heard the same voice. Christy told my mum she got a weird feeling in the house, but my parents just wrote it off and figured it was just a strange coincidence. But this proved to only be the beginning. It was around this time that my mum began capturing these strange balls of light in every picture she took around the house. Now my mum acknowledges herself that capturing a picture or two containing an orb is nothing out of the ordinary, considering orbs can be caused by dust or tricks of the light. But this was different. These orbs were appearing in every picture she would take. My mum cut the camera strap off her camera, tried using disposable Kodak cameras instead of our digital one, and got the house deep cleaned several times. Took pictures in different parts of the house to avoid light contamination, and even bought an entirely new digital camera. But alas, the orbs still appeared in every single photo. There are hundreds of photos sitting in albums in our living room with these massive orbs in them. These orbs will show up later in the story. My mum hosted a group of mothers for young babies at our house, and Christy also happened to be a part of this group. One day the group was over at the house and seated in a circle in our living room, when suddenly Christy looked up towards our couch and screamed, pointing towards it. She looked at my mum in a panic and shouts, "There's a man standing behind your couch!" The rest of the group looked over to see no one. It wouldn't have been possible for there to be someone behind the couch anyway. The couch was pushed up against the wall. Christy grabbed her son and ran out of the house. And although she and my mum remained friends, they haven't seen each other in years, but they're still friends on Facebook, Christy refused to enter the house ever again. Christy had seen the pictures containing the orbs, since they were actually pictures of me and her son together that showed the orbs floating around us. But seeing this man behind the couch was the last straw. She stuck to her word and never returned to the house for the remainder of our time there. It was around this time that my parents began to feel off in the house, especially when spending time in the basement and in my bedroom. My mum would try as hard as she could to avoid spending too much time in the basement, and both of my parents have told me that they feel like they were being watched as they tucked me into bed some nights. And then one day, the activity presented itself while my dad was at work. For a little backstory, I'm not sure if anyone else has experienced this as a child, but I was absolutely obsessed with these classical music CDs called Baby Einstein. They had these weird puppet creatures that represented different artists and composers, and all of the CDs were narrated by the same woman, whose name escapes me now. Anyway, I was in the living room asleep while my mum was in the kitchen cooking. She was playing one of the Baby Einstein CDs over some speakers that we had, so that I wouldn't wake up and bother her as she cooked. As she was cooking, she starts hearing what sounds like a woman talking over the music. My mum could tell it wasn't the narrator, since this woman sounded a lot younger and was talking during one of the pieces, and the narrator only came on between songs. At first, my mum thought she could have just been overhearing someone talking outside, and although my mum couldn't make out exactly what the woman was saying, she described it to me as if hearing the woman having a conversation. She sounded happy, and my mum could hear the tone of her voice changing as she talked. When my mum looked out the blinds of the kitchen window, she saw no one. Thinking maybe it was coming from elsewhere, she walked out onto the deck looking out into the forest behind my house. Again, there was no one. At this point, the woman had stopped talking, and my mum was beginning to be convinced that she was experiencing something paranormal. After this, the activity around the house came to a head. There was one night my aunt was over with my mum, helping her around the house while my dad was at work. Another quick bit of backstory. My room was very dark, and it was sometimes very hard to hear what was going on up there from downstairs. For this reason, my parents bought a baby monitor to stick in my room, so they would know if I was crying or wasn't sleeping well. This was long before the days of video monitors, so all this monitor had was a cheap microphone and some red lights that showed how loud the noise was. Also in my room, sitting directly across from the crib, was an old rocking chair that my mum had inherited from her grandma. My aunt and my mum had just put me to sleep, and were sitting downstairs when they started hearing a noise over the baby monitor. At first they couldn't quite make it out, but very quickly realized what they were hearing. It was the sound of the rocking chair, creaking back and forth as if someone was sitting on it. The only person that should have been upstairs at the time was myself, but I was fast asleep. My aunt and mum were downstairs, and my dad was still at work. The two stood up from their chairs in a panic, but as soon as they stood, the creaking noise suddenly stopped. They walked upstairs and into my room and found nothing out of the ordinary. I was still fast asleep, and the rocking chair looked as though it had never been disturbed. They walked back downstairs, and as soon as they sat back down, the creaking started again. This cycle of creaking over the baby monitor, walking upstairs to find everything undisturbed, and then sitting back down and hearing the creak starting again, continued for an hour, and it reached a point where my aunt was convinced we should leave the house and stay in a hotel for the night. Not too long after, my dad came home, and the creaking stopped completely. At this point, my mum was convinced her and my dad's feeling of discomfort surrounding my bedroom were justified, and began looking for ways to solve the problem. Although my dad remained skeptical, my mum was convinced that what was going on in the house was indeed paranormal, and began trying to find ways to reach out to whatever was inhabiting the house with us. At this point, my mum had accumulated hundreds of pictures containing orbs, and wanted to see if she could capture something more compelling in a photo. One day she decided to take the camera and point it to a random spot in the house. Before snapping the picture, she said out loud, "Can you give me some sort of sign that you're here?" She snapped at the photo, and as she looked down at the screen, she was shocked. Several separate balls of light appear in the center of the screen up against a wall, but they appeared in a straight horizontal line. She was ecstatic that not only did she capture something more compelling than an orb, but also managed to capture some sort of intelligence from what she was now convinced was a spirit living in our home. She tried asking for more signs, but in the absence of anything else, she began combing through the hundreds of pictures she'd already taken, looking for anything else that could show these were more than just a trick of the eye, or dust particles floating through the air. After a good amount of time searching, she found what she was looking for. A picture of me and Christy's son featuring an orb. But this orb was different. Inside the orb was an outline of what appeared to be a sort of face. She immediately began searching around the internet for paranormal investigators and contacted a team in the area to see if they would be willing to come and check out the house. The investigators asked her to tell them about the experiences we'd been having in the house, and although they were a little apprehensive, they finally agreed to check things out. Before coming out to investigate, the investigators told her that normally they would not be willing to come and check out a house if all the residents had to show for the ghost were pictures of orbs and personal testimony, but they were convinced by both the sheer amount of pictures that my mum had and the two very bizarre photos, one featuring the line of orbs and the other featuring the orb with a face. The investigators did come over, albeit slightly skeptical, but immediately began experiencing strange activity. Almost as soon as the investigators walked upstairs into my room, all of their camera batteries died simultaneously. This actually freaked them out, with one of them looking at my dad and saying something like, "Your house is weird, man." These were all new batteries, and they died in 5 minutes. The same thing happened down in the basement, with batteries dying left and right, affecting all sorts of equipment. Microphones and digital recorders picked up strange, staticky feedback, and their electromagnetic field readers picked up odd spikes both in my bedroom and in the basement. My parents' suspicions about the house had been confirmed by professionals, and the investigators were convinced there was something off about the house. After reviewing the evidence and doing some deliberating, the investigators told my parents that they wanted to return to the house a second time, this time with more equipment, since they were convinced there was more evidence to be captured. My parents eagerly set up the follow-up and waited. Now this is where the story becomes a little muddy. I do 100% believe my mum, and the fact that my dad, a skeptic, backs her up on a lot of these stories makes it extra compelling to me. But this last part of the story has always left a bad taste in my mouth. My mum has always been a very spiritual person, always believed in angels, certain stones carrying supernatural powers and the like. She's a therapist and a hypnotist, so I get it. But I guess what I'm trying to say here is to maybe take this final portion of the story with a grain of salt. Yes, it's odd, but I don't want to make assumptions about what was going on, and neither should you. I wouldn't be telling this story if I wasn't convinced it was real. But this final portion has always seemed a little odd. So my mum had set up a consultation with a woman claiming to be a psychic medium, well before the paranormal investigators came over to visit the house. The appointment was only a week or so before the investigators were scheduled for their follow-up. Anyway, during the appointment, the woman asked my mum about the strange experiences we'd been having in the house, and the medium told my mum that she'd picked up on the energy of a man in the house. She said he was lonely, and that he'd latched onto my family since he'd never had one of his own. Obviously that didn't explain the woman's voice we heard in the house, but whatever. Like I said, this whole thing seems a little odd to me. The woman asked my mum if she wanted her to either cleanse the house or leave it be. Knowing the investigators were returning soon, my mum told the woman not to do anything to the house. She wanted to see what could be captured with more advanced equipment. The medium told her she wouldn't, but when my mum returned home afterwards, she noticed the entire house felt different. It felt like a heavy weight had been lifted off the house's atmosphere. She began to suspect that the medium had cleansed the house anyway. Not sure how this is possible, considering the medium never actually visited the house. Maybe someone in the comments can explain how this works. Anyway, and her suspicions were only confirmed when the investigators returned for the second time and captured absolutely nothing. No bizarre EMF readings, no cold spots, no electrical malfunctions, not a thing. After the investigators' return, that was it for the specific flurry of activity. There was a second time we had some weird experiences in the house, which I was actually old enough to remember. But in any case, I don't think they're worth mentioning. In conclusion, I'll say I totally believe the things that my parents told me about the house, partly because there were other witnesses to it, and partly because I witnessed some of the stuff myself years later, and partially because my dad can't explain what was going on, and he was and still is a total skeptic. For him to admit not only that he couldn't explain some of the experiences, but also that it genuinely creeped him out sometimes, has me really convinced that there was something very strange going on in that house. I know, the whole thing with the psychic medium is odd, but my mum would have no reason to lie about it. She got no attention from local newspaper or TV stations in regard to the activity. The paranormal investigators weren't paying to come over to the house, and my mum has always been apprehensive about sharing the story with others. In fact, this is my first time sharing it. I'm not trying to force anyone to believe it, I'm just saying it how it is. It has long been rumored that the house next to me has been haunted. People would come and go like it was a perpetual revolving door. The longest anyone stayed was about 6 months. It was a normal house, upper middle class, tan with a white picket fence, a good-sized deck and a decent yard. The only thing slightly creepy about this house was that a man who had owned the house for years and moved had buried all of his dead pets in the backyard. So it was an animal graveyard of sorts. It sat empty for quite some time, and this is where my experience begins. I was in high school when it happened, probably my freshman year. I had gotten together with 2 friends, Carol and Erin, and we were trying to figure out what to do to keep from being bored. Someone, maybe it was me, decided to go check the house out and see what all the fuss was about. We walked through the open gate and into the backyard. A cable man had recently come by to do some work, which was very odd since no one lived there. After standing in the yard for a minute, we decided to play hide and seek. We opted to draw the boundary line at the front yard and backyard. Going inside was off limits. I would count and they would hide. Well, I found Carol almost immediately, and she decided to help me find Erin. We looked for a few minutes or so when we heard a noise that sounded like movement in the house, kind of like someone scurrying across the floor. We assumed that our friend had broken the rules and gone inside. "Erin," we shouted at the house, "you know inside's off limits." We expected to hear the door open and Erin come walking out, talking about how she just wanted to look, when we hear her come out the bushes behind us, explaining that it wasn't her in the house. We get a look of horror on our faces, and slowly turn to look at the large window that overlooks the yard. The house is pitch black, so it's impossible to see inside. We aren't looking for very long when I see something directly in front of the window. It was a young girl, maybe 11 or 12. The only thing that was out of place was that she wasn't from this time period. She was wearing a dark dress with a high collar and 2 braids down her back. She looked sad and mouthed something that I understand to be "help me." I can't figure out what she means when I see something behind her that made my blood run cold. It's a man about 6 foot 5 feet tall and sinister. He had a look of pure hatred on his face, and his hands reach out as if to take the girl standing in front of him. As fast as he appears, they vanish. I come back to reality and turn to look at my friends. They looked like they'd seen a ghost. I turn to my friend Erin and ask what she saw. She describes the little girl exactly, and saw the man as well. We hightailed it out of there as fast as we could, and have never been back.
About 10 years ago, my family and I were scheduled to go on vacation to Orlando, Florida. I was in my early to mid-20s at the time. I'm a big Disney nerd, and I wanted to go to the parks again since I hadn't been for several years. Everyone was excited and had everything planned out. It was going to be my mum and my dad, my brother, and me, and we were going to rent a house in Orlando that was a short drive from Disney. We'd done this before, and I didn't think anything about it. However, my mum and I both kept having this nagging doubt about the trip. At the time, both of us chalked it up to being nervous about the long drive or having to leave the dogs with someone. There was this nagging sense of, we shouldn't go. But it was Disney. We felt like we had to push these doubts and uncertainties aside for the sake of what was going to be a great vacation. So the trip happened, and a few months later we were in Orlando. Right off the bat, there was something off about the house. The owner contacted us and told us that there had been an issue and that we would have to delay our arrival by a day. Apparently, the previous owners needed an extra day because of some unforeseen emergency. When we arrived at the house, the cleaning team was still working on it, and we ended up having to go wait a few hours in downtown Orlando until we could settle in. No big deal. It just meant shopping and planning for where we would eat dinner that night. We eventually moved into the house later that night and everything seemed okay. The sleeping situation was a bit odd, as it was actually designed to accommodate families with several young children, so this basically meant me sleeping in a child's bedroom on one small double bed with Finding Nemo wallpaper, which is fine. It's a good movie. So 2 nights into the vacation I had a terrible nightmare. I have nightmares when I'm stressed out, but not like this. It was the worst nightmare I'd ever had. I dreamt that I was running through an abandoned building, a big place like a warehouse, and something was chasing me. I never saw it, but in the dream I knew it was cruel and terrifying. It was like I was afraid to look at it. I ran and ran and I heard its huge footsteps stomping the ground behind me as it got closer. Whatever it was caught me and I woke up screaming. Now this may sound comical, but imagine the terror of this happening at 4 in the morning. I woke up screaming, jumped out of bed, and ran as fast as I could down the hallway towards the hall. I didn't know where I was gonna go. I was just terrified and desperate to escape from the creature in my dream. Fortunately, my brother was next door and literally caught me before I ran into the wall. The first thought that went through my head, there was something here when we got here. My mum told me later that when I calmed down and caught my breath, I said in a very shaky, panicky voice that there was something here. How could we have known? I never went back to bed and sat up eating Oreos in the living room until everyone else got up and we were on our way to Orlando to do touristy stuff. We hadn't been out of the house for more than 2 hours when I suddenly became very, very sick. When I say sick, I mean symptoms of severe stomach virus. I was running a high fever, and by the time I got back to the house, it was like I'd been hit by a train, and I'd never been more sick in my life. I laid there in my bedroom surrounded by cartoon fish, and my fever burned. This was the worst that I've ever felt, and I began to hallucinate. My parents and brother made the decision to go back out and leave me in bed to recover. And while I was there alone in the house, fever raging, I saw something standing in the corner of the room. It was tall, dark, and robed. I didn't see its face. This is extremely fuzzy because at the time I wrote it off as a hallucination. It didn't speak, but somehow communicated to me that it would take my pain away if it took my hand. I vaguely remember saying no, and while I was feverish, I had another dream that angels were carrying me on my back, and I was told that I would suffer, but someday I would understand. The fever eventually passed, but I would spend the entire week very sick, and I did not see the black figure again or have any more nightmares, and at the time, I believe it had just been the effect of the fever. Long story short, the vacation continued even though it was a disaster. But it was the long-term effect that have kept my mind on this story for many years. This began a severe downturn in my life that continues to present day. My health and mental state declined, and I spent the next 3 or 4 years dealing with a variety of illnesses, and the next 10 years dealing with some of the most severe depression of my life. But it wasn't just me. My entire family has suffered since the trip. Depression, health issues, a financial struggle have been the norm for the decades since Orlando and the house. A lot of unusually bad luck. I cannot say for certain that this is a paranormal event, but the coincidences cannot be ignored either. I do believe, however, that there is something in that house, and I believe it chose to hurt me specifically, and that the darkness of its touch affected my life for many years to come. I can't speculate as to why it would have happened, or how it got to be there.
I rented a house, and within 3 months of moving in, some weird stuff began to happen. The first thing you need to know is that the previous owner had passed away in the said house after living their whole life there. So on to the story. I was standing in my kitchen, my friend in the living room talking to me. I was telling him how the TV would turn on and off on its own, as well as doors opening and other strange things that started happening recently. I had a drink mixer station on the top of my fridge in the kitchen. The fridge was flat and level as could be. Right as I told him I was getting a little spooked, the drink mixer flings in the middle of the room and drops in the middle of the kitchen. Every little glass jar of mixer shattered. These are thick little glasses that I could have dropped from a high height on my wood floor, and they would have literally been fine. They were flung into the middle of the kitchen and the floor, at least 6 feet away, and didn't touch the fridge at all. My friend and I just stared at each other, mouths open wide, and immediately we yelled out at the top of our lungs to stop messing with us, and that I was going to take good care of their home, and to please stop. I never had anything happen again after that, but I do believe there are spirits out there and forces at work that we don't know about. Gives me goosebumps just remembering it. When I was around 12, I lived in a new high-rise building with my family that felt a little off. Several times when I was able to convince my parents that it's okay to go out and leave me to watch TV alone, I would start hearing voices coming from the direction of the bedrooms that were identical to my family members, as well as the distinct sounds of my mother's high heels, clear as day. There was also this one time where I woke up very early in the morning, walked over to the sitting room to watch a show that only aired at that particular time. 15 minutes after sitting on the sofa, I started hearing a knocking sound on the glass window a few meters behind me. Now, we lived 3 floors up. There were no trees or wires or anything that could touch the glass. No sill for birds to stand on, and no other buildings in front of the window either. The knocking kept going for a good 10 minutes, before it suddenly stopped. I was too terrified to turn and look. It never happened again, during that time, or any other time of day. The apartment also had a small guest bathroom that was shaped like a narrow corridor. When you stepped in, there were 2 sinks on your right, and a small room at the end of the door, with the toilet itself. That little room scared the bejesus out of everyone. It was fine when you were using it and in it, but the moment you turned your back or were leaving it, this intense sense of absolute fear would set in every fiber of your conscious being and scream, "Run." We moved out a year later, and thankfully never saw what was causing the noises. Still boggles my mind thinking about it, considering there was nothing on that land before the building was erected. Me and my brother are now both in our 30s, and the topic of the bathroom came up. Before I told him how I felt, he said he was also terrified of going in there, though no one ever said anything about it at the time. In college, my then boyfriend and I lived in an old house near campus. The house always kind of gave off a creepy vibe, but nothing ominous, and after living there about a year I started seeing things from the corner of my eye. Things I couldn't explain but would convince myself weren't there. One day I was walking through the living room and could have sworn I saw a youngerish guy with long hair wearing jeans and a bandana sitting on my couch. When I looked again, he was gone. Shortly thereafter, the boyfriend's things started to get messed with. He left a stack of magazines on the bed while he went to the shower. When he came back, they were all spread out across the bed, not like the stack had just fallen over but arranged in a grid. Another time in the shower, the water turned suddenly cold. He reached down to turn the hot water up, only to find that the hot water was completely off. He began to feel creeped out, but I never got a bad feeling despite the things I'd seen. I joked that we had a ghost, the bandana hippie guy I saw on the couch, and that he had a crush on me. One night, the boyfriend and I were cooking dinner together. He came up behind me at the stove and started kissing my neck.
I joked. Be careful. Jed, as in, that's what we started to refer to the ghost as, isn't gonna like you doing that. He laughs and says out loud, Sorry, Jed, you can't have her, she's mine. No sooner had the words left his mouth, there was a huge crash in the next room. We go to living room to inspect and find the glass door to our entertainment center is completely shattered. Pieces of glass were flung all over the room like the glass had been hit with something hard. After that, no more weird things happened. No more creepy feelings. No more odd occurrences. Perhaps we broke poor Jed's heart.
Last night I was in my kitchen alone, and just making myself something to eat around 3 a.m. or so, and I can feel something near or around me. While making myself a drink, I can see some sort of dark shadow quickly disappear around the wall, which has a little mirror cabinet in the corner, so I can see right around the wall, and of course, there's nothing there. At this point I can feel something tug at my shirt collar, and the hair on my neck stands up on edge. So I quickly finish making what I had meant to and get back to my room ASAP. I know for a fact that I'm the only person awake, as my sisters are asleep and my brother is out. My mum's at work, and my dad is asleep in his room, so any noises I heard outside were definitely not them. I've read a lot of stories, and at the time thought it might be my mind playing tricks on me. But at this point I know that something is causing me to feel uneasy about the kitchen, or at least that part of the house alone. So after a few minutes I went to put my plate away and basically received confirmation that there is something here. I have a weird paranoia about stuff, so I always check to see if my balcony door is closed and locked, and there is no excess stuff plugged into outlets, that the fan light in the living room is off, the only time I leave it on is when I'm not going to sleep or during the day, and that the sink isn't on in any way, and that the stove dials are all off. I turn them slowly to make sure they are in the off position, then last I checked to see if all the bolts and locks on the main door are locked. Just before I went into my room with the plate, I did all 5 and went to eat. After I came out, I felt that same feeling again, and quickly washed my plate in glass, but then I saw what confirmed it all. In the living room we have this little cabinet with boxes in it. The time it was filled, and the time it was put there was the only time it's been moved. This has not been moved at all since we put it in that spot. But as I walked back to my room I turned around and saw that it was sitting about a foot forward from the wall. Now, had anyone moved it forward to grab something that might have fallen behind it, they would have had to have put it back right away because my mom would get angry. To be honest, now that I think about it, you can't really drop anything behind the cabinet to begin with, as the entire cabinet is squared off and everything would be contained inside. But, as I'm moving back, I looked around to see if anyone was awake, but nope. I turned around to go through my 5 steps again, and the first thing I notice is that the balcony door is open slightly, with the latch. It's a little lever that when it's in the upward position, it will be unlocked, and then it swings downwards towards the side and points down, which is when it locks itself. It is in the halfway point directly 90 degrees pointing to the side. I've never seen anyone in the house doing this, as it would get in the way of opening the door itself due to the latch being in the way of the handle. This confirmed that something is there, but not an intruder. We are about 20 stories up, because I checked everything in the house and nothing, not even in the smallest places to hide. But something even more creepy happened the next morning. I had decided to go check the mail downstairs and got ready. As I stepped outside, the light right above my head started to flicker. I know, cheesy as hell, but I still got that uneasy feeling, so I knew it might not just be the bulb, which, by the way, wouldn't a bulb just go dimmer and then stop working rather than flicker? And my little attentiveness above me. I always look around and walk down the hall when I noticed that the stairwell door was fully shut. The apartment in front of mine and all the others along the hallway were also fully shut. I thought Now this is the perfect time to get a video of all of this. So I turned around and then started to record. There's no wind in the hallway, no doors that need to be closed, as it's on the other floors, and you can't hear what's going on the other floors either. These doors are pretty heavy, so no gust of wind or anything will slam them. It's 30 degrees C, humid, no wind at all unless you were outside. So after I got the mail, I started walking back down the hallway from the elevator, only to be met with the lights working perfectly. I had been gone for 3 minutes, or less, as I had a 3-minute song playing, and it barely finished by the time I came back up. No repairman is that good that he can figure out the light is out, get his ass up there with a ladder, take out the glass around the bulb, replace it, take the old bulb and ladder away, in the elevator which I was just in, within 3 minutes. My girlfriend lives with her grandparents. Her great-grandmother used to live there too, until she passed away in the very room that is now my girlfriend's room. In her will, she left many of her antique items such as her drawers and cabinets. They were very close. A strange thing to mention here is that before she passed away, she told her son, my girlfriend's granddad, who also lives there, that when his time comes, she will take him. In French, it's c'est moi qui viendra te chercher. We live in Quebec. Anyway, for the sake of me telling the story, let's call him Roger. Roger's health had been declining quickly over the past 2 years. As a non-stop smoker who eats overly salty foods and refuses to go to the hospital even for a checkup, you can understand our slight concern. When I first noticed unusual activity in that house, it was minor things. Doors that were left open when they were closed, kitchen drawers that would randomly be opened, the TV would randomly turn on and off, etc. However, as Roger's health deteriorates, the activity in the home is becoming seriously unsettling. For example, one night, her grandparents were going to some camp thing with their friends, so it was just her and I. Her room is in the basement, which is under the living room upstairs. When at about 1 a.m., all we hear and feel is strong footsteps walking around the living room. First of all, the idea of ghosts or anything like that do not cross our mind at the moment, and we were watching Lucifer on TV, so weren't sleeping. And an idea crossed our mind. The only thing you can think of, or at least that we thought, was that there was an intruder in the house. I may be a man and physically fit, but my heart fell to my stomach. I told her to get on the phone and dial 911 while I peeked outside the room and yelled out if someone was there and what they wanted. But I heard nothing, and there was no answer. So then I thought, well, we didn't even hear the footsteps recede or leaving the house. Are they literally just standing there? With the police on the phone, we make our trip up. With me in the front, we get to the living room and nothing. No person, no boot marks, no sign of entering from either of the doors, the back door, or any window. Everything remained locked. The police actually ended up coming anyway to make sure. They went around the house, checked the windows, but also saw that there were no signs that anyone could have gone in. We thanked them and they left. My girlfriend is convinced that these experiences have been her great-grandmother, somehow still wandering the house. Because of this, she has no fear at all, and communicates with her using pendants and witchcraft things, which I don't believe in at all, but I thought were worth mentioning. Whatever the case is, those footsteps were not the footsteps of some frail old woman. They were heavy and menacing. Is she in the wrong? Should she stop communicating with something just because she believes it to be her great-grandmother? Or should I just never step foot into that house again? I personally am feeling more of the latter option. To give some background, we are a young professional couple in our late 20s, and this happened 3 years ago. Personally, I've always believed in the paranormal, as I've had a few experiences growing up. My dad also works as a medium and paranormal investigator. He taught me to always to be skeptical and look for a logical explanation, but my upbringing also gave me an open mind. In contrast, my partner Andy is not a believer in anything like that. He can sometimes be quite scathing on the whole subject. We were looking to move closer to my work in a town called Stroud, in the county of Gloucestershire, England. We had 2 cats, so it was hard to find a landlord that accepted pets. We saw this gorgeous property become available after a month of searching. It was a 16th century cottage on the outskirts of town. It had been used as a mill hop in the 16th and 17th century, and had then been turned into a residential property around the mid-1800s. As soon as we went inside, we fell in love with it. It had 2 large downstairs reception rooms, a spacious kitchen, and 3 big bedrooms upstairs. There was also a strange little door under the stairs that led to an enormous basement area. Walking around during the viewing, I did feel a little on edge, as the atmosphere in an upstairs bedroom and the front room downstairs felt a bit heavy. I reminded myself that it was probably just in my head, and we went ahead and put the deposit down to make it ours. On our moving day, the landlord met us and talked us through everything. He mentioned that the staircase was not original, and that it had been taken from a theatre in Oxfordshire and installed in the house. He was very good at working with wood. This might seem like a random fact, but we later had experiences on that staircase, so I do wonder if it held any residual energy. We moved in, and it was as stressful as any moving day was. We were both knackered by the evening, and once the bed was up, we agreed to have an early night. We chose a back bedroom as our main one, the one I had felt the heavy atmosphere in, as it was the biggest, and you couldn't hear the road from there. The house was right on a main road that led up to the Cotswolds Hills. We are lying in bed chatting when I felt the atmosphere change and get heavy and dark. I said as much to Andy, who told me I was just tired. Then slowly I started to see small slivers and blue lights appear in the air. They were about the size of a 5p coin and would appear gliding slowly through the air, leaving a glowing after trail behind them. I pointed them out to Andy and was surprised when he said that he could see them as well. As we were facing away from the road, I don't think it could have been car headlights, and they moved in arcs and erratically anyway. This lasted for about 10 minutes, and then they slowly faded away and the atmosphere lifted. I was surprised that we had both witnessed it. Andy took a picture, which you can see on screen. From that day, we started to have small little things happen around the house. One of the most common was to hear footsteps walk up and down the stairs and landing. This scared me very much when I first heard it, as I would often be home in the evening and would be alone when I did. It was loud enough for me to think it was a burglar and to hide in the back room and call Andy. Of course, when we checked, no one was there. It was certainly too loud a noise for our cats to make, and we believed they were downstairs with me at the time anyway. Another occurrence was that objects and ornaments would be moved around. We would find heavy ornaments carefully placed on the floor, and also in the hallway, a whole room away from where they had been originally. I also used to randomly find large pine cones placed on the stairs and on the sofa. We were not near any pine trees, and did not own any pine cone ornaments. This was all bearable, but I did feel uncomfortable on my own, especially in the front room of the house, which was a long, panelled reception room with a big fireplace. The fireplace had a heavy iron grate that we also would come home to find moved across the room seemingly by itself. It always seemed like someone was standing in the corner of the room watching me. I felt silly saying this to Andy, but at a later date he also said that that particular corner made him feel watched. A year went by with these small strange things happening. We were mostly unconcerned with it, until the activity seemingly started to get more intense. One of the first things to happen was the basement door started opening by itself. This was strange as it had a knob you had to physically turn to open, and then pull it quite hard. It would also jam quite easily, and I had to get a knife to unjam it often. We would then come down in the morning, and it would be wide open, sometimes with the basement lights on too. Our electrical also seemed to go haywire at this point. My partner had a computer tower in our bedroom with a large push-down button that you had to hold down to turn it on. It made a loud, very characteristic whoosh sound when it started up. It started to turn itself on quite often, noticeably at 5 a.m. when we were both asleep. I'm a very light sleeper, so it would always wake me up. Now we have kept that computer in motion since, and it has not turned itself on in that manner. The TV would turn itself on though, as with the lamp that we kept in our bedroom. I would wake up to the light being on full whack. It had an adjustment slider. Our bedroom window would also open itself in the middle of the night. It had a heavy latch that I could hear unhook itself, and it would then swing open and crack loudly against the side of the house. When we first moved, our bed was directly under this window, which made me uncomfortable for some reason. Hearing and seeing it open in the night was incredibly unnerving. We did then move the bed, and I felt a little more comfortable afterwards. One of the scariest things was that we would start to hear voices around the house. If either of us used the toilet on the landing, we would sometimes hear what I can only describe as a deep male mumbling outside the door. This sometimes happened when either one of us was on our own in the house. Andy also experienced someone tapping on the door, which I also heard from downstairs. I frequently heard my name called from different parts of the house by a female voice. Stupidly, I did make my own Ouija board from paper and tried to contact the spirit to see what it wanted. Nothing happened, except that I felt very uncomfortable afterwards. So much so that I picked the makeshift Ouija up and put it in the rubbish bin outside. 2 days later, the Ouija paper reappeared on my coffee table seemingly unmarked. This scared me so much that I then burnt it. I did question Andy, but he had no reason to go through the bin and would not have been remotely interested in the Ouija anyway. Around this time, I asked my dad to come over for lunch one day, and he brought his dog, a lovely big Akita, with him. He was a very gentle dog who rarely growled and got aggressive. The dog was incredibly reluctant to come through the front door, and when he did, we couldn't make him move from a spot just below the staircase. He stood rigid, all fur on end, ears back, and growled up at the stairs. He did this for about 20 minutes, and then yelped and ran into the front room. The cats were safely popped in the back room downstairs, and there was no one else in the house but me, my dad, and the dog. Andy would cycle home on an evening after work. Now, as he cycled up the road, the side of the house would become visible. You could see the kitchen, the upstairs bathroom window, and also the window to our spare room upstairs. On this particular evening, I was cooking in the kitchen downstairs, and saw Andy's bicycle lamp approach from the road. I waved, and he waved back and came inside. When he came in, he said, "Oh, I didn't know you had your sister over." I was baffled, as it was just me, and told him so. He went white, and told us that our upstairs spare room light was on and that he'd seen a figure pulled back against the curtains wave to him, and then go behind the curtain. We both ran upstairs, and of course there was no one there at all, just the light on that I had not turned on. There are too many small things to list entirely, but some notable mentions are that Andy was having sleep paralysis one night and screamed awfully until I woke him up. He said he had seen a white figure approaching slowly up the bed. This has been the one time this has ever happened to him. Our power box once switched off, even though the neighbors were fine. Our power switched off, even though the neighbors were fine. So, we looked to our power box and switched it all back on, and joked that it must have been the ghost. We went upstairs after this, and it shut off again by itself. I also saw a lady in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform in my dream. She walked into our bedroom and smiled at us. There was an ornament that was flying gently off the unit while I watched, and then it landed gently to the floor. Towards the end of our tenancy, we had two things happen that stuck with me. It was a stressful time, and the atmosphere was not great anyway. One night we were both in bed reading. On the back of our bedroom door was a hook, and on the hook I had hung a fairly large slate heart. We were reading quietly when we both suddenly looked up at the door. The heart started to swing upwards in the air as if someone were holding it, and then slammed back down on the door so hard it made the frame shake. We both leapt up and checked the landing outside our bedroom. It was freezing cold and had an extremely unfriendly feel to it. On our very last day, we had help from Andy's parents. I'd hung up the original pictures back on the wall in the front room. They were all very secure. I can't remember properly, but I believe that we had an altercation with a rude neighbour over parking, and Andy and his mum got very agitated. We all stood in the hallway, and there were some raised voices. Suddenly there was a huge crack from the front room. The pictures that I had just hung carefully were all on the floor. The string was intact, as were the hooks that I'd hung them up on, and we all made a hasty retreat. It's also worth mentioning that since we've lived there, the house has had quite a lot of different tenants, who all seem to move out within a few months. Seems we're not the only one who are plagued by paranormal activity. From ages 13 to 16, I lived in a rural house with my mum. She worked late each night, and my brother would go to his girlfriend's house after school, so I would take the bus home, and it would drop me off at my house. I would do chores as soon as I got home so that I could play my video games or make my clay sculptures. I was alone in the house aside from a small dog almost every weekday until around 7. I was washing dishes one afternoon, and I heard footsteps coming up from the basement, which was adjacent to the kitchen. There was a signature sound the stairs made because of the plastic tread that was either glued or nailed to them. It was a little creaky, gritty, plastic tapping sound, so I don't think it could have been the house settling. The sound grew louder behind me, as if someone was coming up the stairs. The footstep sounds were about to reach the top of the stairs, but I couldn't bring myself to look at the doorway to go to the stairs. I dropped the dish in the sink, grabbed the dog and ran outside and waited in the gravel driveway until my mum came home from work. This wasn't the only thing that happened. We had a makeshift family room in the basement, and we would watch movies in the basement and could hear footsteps in my brother's old room, like heavy boots or something walking around upstairs. Could it have been the house settling? But it terrified all of us. I recall one specific occasion where we had a couple of friends over and we rented some movies. When we had guests over, we would gather in the proper living room upstairs next to the kitchen. We were switching between DVDs when we heard a whistling tune coming from the basement. My mother and I both heard it and looked at each other, and we asked our guests if they heard it. Our guests heard nothing, and I went to investigate because I felt safer with other people in the house. I checked the TV in the basement. It was off. Nothing was out of place, no signs where it could have come from. It could have been the pipes or the water heater, but I never heard it creak or whistle, or anything like that before or after. Just as my brother was getting ready to leave for the military, my grandma stayed with us for a week to see him off. She took my brother's room after he left, and she kept hearing someone pound on the door in the middle of the night. My mum told me she heard the same pounding on her door as well. I had an attic bedroom, so I never heard it. I called my mum asking her details, and she said there were lots of crazy things that happened. She recalled that when my grandma was cooking dinner in the kitchen by herself, a glass was thrown at her, and it busted on the wall next to her. My grandma insisted she didn't break the glass, and was offended that we thought she broke it somehow. One night not long after, I had a dream that was weird. In the dream, I woke up in my bed because there was something scraping against the window that was right next to my headboard. I got out of bed and looked out the window and saw the tree branch scraping against it. I looked at the tree and there was a glowing face staring back at me. My impression from this was someone was hanging from the tree. Then I woke up again in real life. I told my mum about the dream and we went on with our lives. About a week or so later, I was jumping on our trampoline outside and my mum and her boyfriend were making hot dogs on the grill. Our landlord was mowing the grass, and his riding mower got stuck in a dip or hole in the ground on the side of the house outside my window. My mum's boyfriend said to give him a hand getting the mower out, because he was an older fella. I helped him out and then I asked him, why is there a hole in the ground right there? He said that that's where a tree used to be, but he had removed it because it kept scraping against the side of the house. My mum heard the conversation, and she and I both went kind of pale. The landlord finished up, and we all went on about our day. It was spooky. We moved to another town when I was 16 for unrelated reasons. I tried to look at these occurrences with doubt and criticism, but I still can't wrap my head around what was going on in that house all those years later. From the ages of 5 to 12, I lived in what I believe to be a haunted house. My first experience was when I was probably 8 or so. I had woken up just as the sun was about to rise, and my bed was directly next to a window. I sat up and peered out of the blinds and saw the glow from the sun starting to rise. I also saw what appeared to be a 40-year-old man standing on the curb staring directly into my window. I was startled and quickly pulled up my head away from the blinds and sat there for about 10 seconds before I pulled the blinds slightly to the side to look again. This time the man was about a foot away from my window, and I screamed in horror and moved away from it. My mother came in, but no one was outside the window when she looked. The man looked slightly older and was wearing reading glasses. His complexion was white and translucent. He looked like a regular man, but the second time I looked, his mouth was gaping wide open, almost as if he had a broken lower jaw. A few years later, I had my second experience. I walked out of my bedroom during the night to get a drink from the kitchen. The lounge room was in the center of the kitchen and was joined to it off the left. On the right side of the lounge room was the front room. I walked down the hall to the entrance of the lounge room. My mother had left the light on during the night, so that if any of the kids woke up, they could move around easy. As I got to the entrance of the lounge room, I noticed a figure to the right of me near the front door. A very tall woman was walking towards me. I stood frozen in fear as she walked past me and seemed to reach out and grab something of a corkboard in the kitchen. She then turned around and walked straight past me and again through the front door. As she did not take her eyes off me and stared directly at me the whole time. She had the same complexion as the man, and I could see clearly the wrinkles on her face. She was very tall, maybe close to 7 foot. She had brown hair and a white gown on. I was fixated on her, but out of my peripheral I could see what looked like a piece of paper, which she took from the corkboard. The way she stared at me the whole time still horrifies me 20 years later. Telling the story to my family when I was about 18, a few others had different encounters. My brother saw 2 dark figures sitting at the dining table, seeming to be peeling potatoes. My sister saw a little boy poke his head out around the doorframe as she sat in the bathtub. We moved out, and life went on. In the fall of 2016, I moved into half of a really old house that was built in the 1880s, a stone's throw away from the original campus of Indiana University, which is now a park filled with homeless people and drug addicts. The owners basically turned it into a weird duplex. My friend had lived in it right before I moved in and claimed that it was haunted, but I really didn't believe him because he was a bit of an odd guy. The layout of the house was weird. You walked into the door and were in a living room type of space, and then you kept walking, and there was a doorway to a bedroom. Past that, the kitchen. No doors. The only door inside the apartment was to the bathroom and the one that led to the shared basement. So my first night there was uneventful. I was a little uncomfortable because I hadn't lived by myself in a long time and was just feeling lonely and on edge. I stayed up late and then eventually fell asleep, but I woke up again at around 3 in the morning. Cliché, I know. What woke me up was what sounded like a group of drummers drumming on every flat surface of the living room. It went on for a while, and I was completely terrified. It was just a cacophony of sounds. After about 2 or 3 minutes, I finally gathered up the balls to get up and check on it. As soon as I passed the threshold to the living room, it just stopped. Nothing happened the rest of the night, but I didn't get much sleep. A few days later, my friend was visiting, and he was about to leave. We were standing by the front door next to my bookshelf, and I told him how I was having trouble sleeping, and the story from the night before. As I was saying this, a book threw itself off the bookshelf and onto the floor 3 feet away. It had to fly past the dresser, the shelf it was perched, and landed between the two of us. He just gave me a creeped out look and said he had to go. I don't blame him. Eventually I asked the guy in the other half what was up, as he had lived there for 8 years. He told me that no one stayed there longer than a year, and they all reported the same stuff. For whatever reason, he said nothing ever happened on his side. Doesn't make sense, but there it is. On top of that, you would hear stuff shuffling around a lot in the room you were in. The light to the shared basement would randomly come on at night, even when the neighbor was traveling. Sometimes I would feel something get into my bed, like a cat, and nothing was ever there. Even after I ended up with a pair of cats, I had a lot, and I mean a lot, of nightmares while there. That was the bulk of it. But I have 2 stories that were more notable, and here they are. The first one was when I was woken up sometime in the middle of the night to a loud crashing sound. So in the living room there was an old electric organ with about 6 inches of clearance from the wall. I stashed a folding chair like you would buy in IKEA in between the organ and the wall. The crashing sound was the folding chair being unfolded and slammed into the middle of the room. By this point I already had the cats, and they were just sitting there staring at me when I came into the room. The second, I will admit, may have a conventional explanation, but I find it so much more scary if it were paranormal. I'll let you decide. At some point I reconnected with an old friend who'd moved home from California when his father got cancer. He ended up living with me, which was not ideal because, as I said earlier, there were no doors, no privacy. But we became close friends. Being poor, we made it work. So he ended up dating this girl who lived about 3 blocks down the road and would often leave and sleep over there. I got him a job where I worked 9 to 5, and we would alternate driving to work in the morning. Anyway, one night he's over at his girl's house, spending the night, and I went to bed. Sometime in the night he came back home, and he went to use the bathroom, which was in my room. Remember, no doors? So he had to walk past my bed to use the toilet. I wake up. He's there taking a leak, and I can see the light on under the door. When he's done and turns off the light, he lays down to sleep on the couch. It's winter, and the cats had been escaping and coming back late at night. And one of them had been outside earlier, so I wonder if he had come in with my roommate, and if not, if he would have seen him coming home and waiting at the door. So I decided to get up and check. I go to the door, open it, but there's no Luke. I close the door, and he is sitting right there by my feet with his sister. Okay, I look at the couch. The roomie's already fast asleep as usual. All is good, and I go back to sleep. In the morning I wake up and my roomie's gone. I go about my routine and step out to smoke a cigarette while my car warms up. As it gets closer to 9, I begin to debate leaving him to drive himself when I see him coming sprinting down the sidewalk. We get in the car and start for work. I ask him what time he left in the morning to go back to his girlfriend's house. He said he was there all night. I just about crapped my pants. I know for a fact the door was locked because the door had some ancient lock design that locked automatically every time you used it. And I also know for a fact that my cat was outside, and in the morning he was back inside. I really don't know what to make of it, but it was really unsettling. And just for fun, a small third story. I said earlier my house was not far from a park that junkies and the homeless frequented. In the summer of 2017 it was late, and I heard a bunch of noises on my porch, so I went to investigate. There were two dudes huddled right by my steps with a flashlight, and I asked them what they were doing. They replied using English words, but not something I would describe as a language, and they started walking towards that park, through my yard, and the whole time one of them was just calling back to me, "Hey, it's the dark. Sorry." In the summer of 2015, my husband and I were house sitting for these rich people in between our big move to the mainland, as we're from Hawaii, and some really crazy creepy stuff started happening just a few days in. The first weird thing that happened was when we got there I couldn't find how to get the motion sensor light in the entry garage hallway to turn off. We thought nothing of it. A few days later I was watching TV, and you can see the front door from the living room, and I saw a shadowy man walk by the front door. I wasn't particularly freaked out, because unfortunately shadow people are frequent visitors of mine. I think it must have been a Hawaii thing because everyone has seen them there. I think it must have been that same evening that I hadn't seen my husband for several minutes. So I called out to him, and saw that front motion detector light flip on again right at that moment. So I walked out to it and heard him go, "What?" from the backyard, not the front yard. I quickly walked to the backyard through the house, and staring back towards the front yard I saw an orb zoom out the house and into the yard. A side note on orbs, I've watched those paranormal shows on Discovery Channel but never thought they were real until I actually saw them. Anyway, fast forward a few days, a different motion detecting light started going crazy one night, flipping on and off in varying intervals. At this point my husband, who you might call the rational one, is totally freaked out. I, however, felt extremely curious and wanted to investigate, which is so weird for me because I'm a total scaredy cat. I even make my husband walk me to the bathroom in the middle of the night because I'm too scared to go by myself. But I just felt compelled to go towards the garage upstairs area, and there's an apartment above the garage, and figure out what's going on. We got a flashlight and shined it into the garage and apartment windows, and we couldn't help feeling this very, very weird dread and fear emanating from it. Even though I was curious, I also felt it in the pit of my stomach, like some overwhelming depression or evil. We called it quits, I locked the doors, and we went to bed after that. There were several other things that we encountered while we were staying there. One evening I heard someone say, "Ding dong," kind of like how someone would say when they get to a friend's house to inform them of their presence, after which the dogs, as we were also dog sitting, went nuts barking at the front door, although there was no one there. One night when we were walking into the bedroom, something brushed up against my arm, and when I turned I saw a person walking the other way down the hallway, turning a corner. Myself and one of the dogs saw an orb fly out of a room we were in. The dog definitely saw it too, and he looked freaked out. One morning while showering I dropped my razor on the ground, and when I bent down to pick it up, it was on the countertop across the bathroom. One morning my husband dropped his toothbrush and he couldn't find it for an hour, and then it reappeared on the countertop. I've had a lot of ghostly paranormal encounters in my life, but this last summer just puts it over the top. At one point I was in tears asking my husband why I'm so perceptive and why these things keep happening to me. My family was helping a family friend find good houses to settle down in. He came from China and was new to the area we lived in, so we attempted to help him find a place. We came across this open house and went inside. The real estate agent knew my mother from previous business partnerships, so he told us to just lock up when we leave. We were walking inside for a while, and there was suddenly an echo upstairs, like those creaking noises you hear when someone steps on a wooden floor that's not well placed. We thought someone was up there, but we were the only 5 people in the house, and the agent just came from the upstairs before telling us to lock up later. We ignored it at first, until the creaking noise went on for several seconds, and no one wanted to go and check it out. We were all kind of scared, since you had to go upstairs to turn on the lights and literally no one wanted to go up, even as a clump. After we left the house, my mum called the selling agent, and he told her that other people have heard these noises in the house, on the first story, as the second story is where the noises come from. That selling agent later said that there was a recent death by suicide on the second floor, which brought me chills. We never went back to that house or general area. Not sure if ghosts are real, but something was definitely making a noise up there. Maybe the house was just old and people walking inside would make the noise, but it didn't explain how the sound was coming from upstairs when we were all down. As of today, I'm a 28-year-old female, but growing up I was a very sensitive little boy. My parents adopted me as a baby, and I never met my birth family until 2012. It was then I learned that every woman in my birth family were all quite sensitive to the paranormal. Nobody in my adoptive family had any sort of sensitivity, but they all did things subconsciously. When I was 9, my family moved to a very nice house in St. Helena, Napa, overlooking the valley. It was a beautiful 2-story house, but in a weird way since it was on a hill. From the road, the second story was the first, but from the backyard down the mountain, both floors were visible. I believed it was called a sloped lot. Upstairs were the garage, linked to the main house by a breezeway leading to the laundry room. To the right was the study, and straight ahead was a living room and a kitchen. A hallway ran parallel to the kitchen, meeting at a family/dining room, where the front door sat, though none of us actually used it. Right next to that were the stairs, oh the dreaded stairs, leading down to one long hallway connecting the bedrooms. The experiences began happening immediately after we moved in. Part of me believes it was drawn to the negative trauma I suffered at the hands of my abusive father, who focused his rage mostly on me. And that's why I was targeted out of my brothers. But that's just a theory. The first of my many experiences was when the whole family was at my middle school for a scholastic book fair. I remember having a sudden twisting in my gut when my parents got a call that our backyard was on fire. To this day, nobody knows how it happened. It just started. Then the real fun began. It started out slowly, and only ever happened downstairs. My brothers and I would wake up and see a man walking back and forth on the patio, glancing through the French doors of our bedrooms as he passed. We never felt malice from him, and we all recalled seeing him. What makes that particular bit interesting is that from a child's perspective, usually the male entity would be malicious, while the female entity could be a protector. In my house, it was the polar opposite. Myself and my brothers felt a dark presence lurking downstairs in the hallway that would affect all three of us, to the point where we would take the stairs 2 or 3 at a time as fast as possible. I would have a recurring nightmare about struggling to get to the top of the stairs when something caught behind me. In one particular dream, I was reaching for the top stair, and the entity caught me and strapped my mouth shut so I couldn't scream. Keep in mind, I was too young for these things to naturally come to me. In the beginning, the door to my bedroom would slam in the wee hours of the morning, so loudly it would wake my father. He insisted it was a draft, even though no one else's doors would do it, and again it slammed with a massive force. We had to put a 10-pound bookend in front of it. Not much later, the entity in the hall would probe our bedrooms to see who was the most sensitive. My older brother, who slept at the end of the hall, nearest the darkness, outgrew his empathetic sensitivity. And my younger brother eventually stopped as well. But I remained more sensitive than ever, and I knew it. And that's when I met her. When the entity first introduced itself, I felt like it was kind of a protector, like the man from the balcony. But I knew that it wasn't true. She would stand at the far end of the hallway and wait. Not that she was actually there, There was no one there, but it was more of a feeling of perpetual dread. It wasn't darkness or blackness, but more that it physically sucked the light in around it like a dark hole. She would come to me in dreams as various entities, but the man would always show up and protect me. Mind you, I neither knew her nor the man, and the fact that the house was built on an inactive volcano littered with limestone and obsidian probably boosted the energy or what have you. For about 7 years I would wake up promptly at 3 a.m. sweating bullets, hearing someone running back and forth in the hallway, panting as they passed my room, repeatedly until around 5 a.m. when it began to get light. The first face-to-face incident with this creature was when I woke up at scheduled at 3 a.m. like clockwork and heard the panting and pacing in the hallway. After about 20 minutes I got too scared to sit there and do nothing and reached to the dresser by my bed and turned on the light. The panting and pacing stopped, and I waited about 10 seconds of soul-crippling silence before it happened. Long, gnarly, shadowy fingers slowly gripped the doorframe one by one. I heard the wood of the frame creak slightly as the wispy fingers pulled into the bedroom. Before my brain could process what I was seeing, I heard her gasp, like an audible gasp. The fingers retreated in pain, and I sat in silence until the sun came up 2 hours later. That was the first time I realized I had a weapon against this thing. I still don't fully understand it, but she couldn't exist in night. While that alone brought tears to my eyes recalling it, there was one other experience that haunts me to this day. Plenty of years had gone by now, and I had turned 14. My father was a prominent doctor in the area, and he was planning on taking my mother to a fancy hospital gala the same night my little brother had a sleepover at a friend's house, and my older brother was out college shopping in some other county. It was the first time I had the house to myself at night. I begged them to reschedule or hired me a babysitter. They told me I was old enough to be a babysitter and that I needed to grow up. Everyone in my family, them included, experienced weird happenings, but they all preferred to turn a blind eye. So my pleas fell on deaf ears and I was left alone. I spent the first half of the evening upstairs where it was safe, occasionally glancing towards the staircase for any activity from the living room while the TV distracted me. About 10 or 11 p.m., I remember thinking that I was too old to be scared to be by myself, and I could sleep downstairs alone if I wanted to. I kept the lights on upstairs and slowly descended the staircase, feeling the darkness getting closer with every step. When I reached the last step, I leaped to the light switch and hit it, illuminating the hallway, shaking violently. I hurried to my bedroom. Through the eerie quiet, my footsteps on the carpet were the only sound to break the silence. I finally slunk into my bedroom and quickly turned on the dresser light, jumping into bed as I stared into the lights shining through the downstairs. Going over in my head that all the doors were locked, all the windows were closed, and that as long as these lights were on I was safe, the lassitude of Morpheus overcame me, and my mind began to wander into the fields of Nod. Unlike the usual times I woke up at night, this time was slightly different. I woke up suddenly completely alert, with the fight or flight response already kicking in. I was facing the wall, but was absolutely terrified. I felt like if I moved or even breathed too loudly, it would spell immediate death. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, but was most likely only a few minutes, before I mustered up the courage to roll over. When I did, my heart sunk. All the lights in the house were off, and a womanly shadow was standing in the doorway, and thought that maybe my mother had popped her head in, before I realized she was with my father at the gala all night, and they were staying in a hotel until morning. I just sat there frozen, locked in gaze with this creature, who finally made it through the threshold of my doorframe and into my room, a feat she had yet to accomplish. I closed my eyes and repeated in my head that it isn't real. It isn't real. I was trying to control my breathing as I shake and shiver violently. and I decide to peek and see if she's still there. Surely she can't come in further. I open my eyes. It's standing right over me, at the edge of my bed looking down at me. Not with its eyes. It didn't have eyes. What it did have was a large, toothy grin amidst the wispy shadows of its body. I daredn't scream and even move, but hold the gaze as I heard a deep rumble emanating from the swirling torrent of darkness that was this creature. Having grown up terribly abused, I knew fear, but this was something else. I had never been this afraid before in my life. It was no longer creaks or shadows darting in the corner of your eye. It was face to face with me. Something else, something not of this world. And it wanted me. I knew in this moment, as if its mouth began to expand, that if I did nothing I would die. So I did the only thing I could think of in that moment. My body suddenly lurched upwards from the bed towards the entity, and I screamed at it. Not a scream of fear, but more like a war cry. Like it could try to kill me, but I wasn't planning on making it easy. My face almost went through it, as it lurched up before it recoiled and let out an unearthly wail. As it heard my cry, it left the room. Within moments, all the lights in the house were back on, and I just sat there shivering in shock until the dam broke and I began to cry. I just cradled my pillow and rocked back and forth on the bed, sobbing until the sun came up and my parents returned home. My family, devout Catholic doctors, were already skeptical of these things and didn't believe me, attempting to convince me it was a night terror or perhaps sleep paralysis. Only I could move. I could think. I wasn't stuck. And it actually happened. I know I didn't dream it because I stayed awake until the next day. I don't expect anyone to believe me. But this was just the kind of thing that happened in this house. I believe it was limited to that specific location because it didn't follow me to college or anywhere else beyond. I fear for those who moved in when my parents sold it, but it would be cool to get in touch with who lives there and ask if they've experienced similar things. And we did have trouble selling it. It was on the market for years. Anytime someone would come to view it, they would get creeped out and leave. Anyway, that's my story. I personally don't believe in demons or anything gaudy, but I'll respect you if you do. If you have any theories on what it could have been, feel free to comment.
We moved into the house in 2001 when I was 11, and my younger sister was 10. When we were kids, we used to wake up late at night and go to each other's rooms to chat, play with toys, and sometimes go downstairs to watch TV or eat directly from the fridge. Her room was in the front part of the house, so during the night the street lights would illuminate her room with an orange light. My room was on the back of the house, and my window faced the backyard, which had no lights. So during the night her room was always lit, and mine totally dark. From her room you could see the door to mine, and since we slept with the doors open, if you looked from her room into mine, you would only see darkness. This is important for later. One night, my sister was laying in bed trying to fall asleep, when suddenly she saw me standing in her doorway. She'd never heard my steps though. It was like 1 second she wasn't there, and then I suddenly was. She didn't give it much thought since she assumed I stepped in when she wasn't looking. "Hey," she said, "I can't sleep. You wanna watch some TV downstairs?" Allegedly, I said nothing. "Did you hear me? You wanna watch some TV?" She whispered a little louder, trying not to wake our parents. I stood there with a blank expression on my face without moving an inch. It was then my sister realized that despite all her room having this orange tone because of the streetlight, I was glowing blue and appeared to glow like the TV. After a few moments of fear, she said, "You're not my brother." Then the thing started to move towards her, but not walking, just sliding across the floor like a hologram. She put her pillow over her head and screamed so loud she awoke everyone in the house. When my parents got into her room, she was hysterical, and explained to them what happened, but of course they thought it really was me just trying to scare her. I was scolded for it, despite me waking up when I heard the scream just like them. My sister knew I had nothing to do with it though. Sometimes my sister would see a tall, thin figure, glowing in pink, with a giant turban on his head like the ones Ottomans used to wear in the 16th century. Mind you, we live in South America, so not many Ottomans around here that I know of. This entity would come from downstairs at night, turn left and disappear into the darkness of my room. My sister said the thing that scared her the most about the turban guy was how fast he would climb the stairs. In fact, it was so fast that she could never have a good look at his face. There was also one time when my sister was around 13 and was babysitting my twin 8-year-old cousins in our house. My parents weren't supposed to be coming back until past 11 p.m. Around 8 p.m, they were all watching TV in my parents' room, when one of my cousins wanted to have a snack, so he headed downstairs alone. When he was halfway down the stairs, he heard some noises in the kitchen, like someone was moving around dishes and cooking pots. "Auntie?" he said, thinking my parents came back early. There was no reply. The noises stopped. Then the sound of heavy footsteps getting closer approached. He bolted up the stairs, got back to the room with my sister and my other cousin yelling that there was someone in the house. My sister locked the bedroom door, pushed the bed towards the wall and listened as the footsteps came up the stairs. As if this wasn't disturbing enough on its own, these footsteps didn't sound like this person was wearing boots or shoes. It sounded as if they were coming up barefoot. At this point, my sister and my cousin are all holding each other off, sitting on the floor, terrified, crying and freaking out. They really thought it was the end. They'd heard as this person came closer and closer until it was on the other side of the door, then silence and nothing happened. They never heard the person leaving either, just silence. At the time, we only had one phone in the house and it was downstairs near the kitchen, so there was no way to call the police or anything, and they decided to stay in the room until my parents came back. When they arrived, they found all the kids crying in the room, and after hearing what happened, they searched the whole house for intruders. Of course, none were found. There were no open doors or windows, no forced locks or anything. After that, my cousins never stayed in the house alone until they were much older. This experience marked my sister, and she got so scared at the house at night that she started to stay awake all night in her room with the lights on and only slept during the day. She did this for about a year, from when she finished school until she found a job and moved out to her own apartment.
I work as a care assistant for elderly individuals in rural areas of England. There is one house that we used to go to that I jokingly called the murder house, because it looked like something you'd see in a movie dealing with mysterious murders. Not the most affectionate name, but it was all in all a jest, and the lady I cared for certainly thought it was funny. She lived in a 10-bedroom farmhouse surrounded by empty barns and cellars. If it was windy, there was a shed in the back garden that would creak, and it wasn't fun to be alone in at night. But the lady was a dream, super nice, loved to banter, and was genuinely so kind. She would tell me stories about her husband and how he was perfect and lovely, and she missed him so much as he had died 7 years prior from cancer. She had pictures of him all around the house. Other carers that I worked with had noted some experiences at the house. During the daytime, one girl was making the bed and glanced out the window to see a man gardening that didn't look like the usual gardener. She went to our client and explained, "Oh, Sarah, you got a new gardener," and proceeded to describe the man she saw. Sarah would smile and say, "That's my husband. I bought him that jacket 30 years ago, and he used to wear it for gardening." She seemed to gain comfort from the thought of him being there, which was precious. I had never had an experience at the house until 5 months of going to see her. I wasn't on shift, but had come in with my co-worker who had her call, so I sat in the chair across from her bed and spoke with her. Behind the chair was nothing but wall, and beside me on the left was a large chest and to my right a bookcase. As I was speaking, I felt a calming presence over me, and I felt like my co-worker had re-entered the room and had walked behind my chair and was standing to my right. This was odd, but I turned to include her in the conversation. She wasn't there. Confused, I looked back, and Sarah shrugged, saying I must have just been hearing things. It was weird, and to this day I still get chills thinking about it. My dad passed away in a motorcycle accident about 10 years ago, and after he passed, weird stuff started happening at the dorm when I got back. The clock would fall off the wall and change time, batteries would separate themselves from remotes, and bangs and knocks were regular. But the weirdest thing that would happen was when I was coming home from college and took a shower, got dressed, and headed back into the bathroom to finish getting ready. And the mirror was just clearing the steam off, and lo and behold, I see smear marks faintly that looked like letters. So I tip the mirror because it's one of those triple pane medicine cabinet mirrors, and I see "Hey" spelled out in his handwriting with the elven eye symbol from Lord of the Rings that my dad would put everywhere. This was probably 6 months plus after he passed, and I have no idea where it came from since it was only me and my mum in the house, and I knew she wouldn't do that. The crazy part is like a week before that, I had broke open a glow stick and splashed it on the mirror, but the writing was under the splashes, and none was smeared or touched. Still to this day I can't explain how that happened. We actually took the entire mirror off the wall so it wasn't ruined. My grandma and great-grandma and their dog moved into an old cabin. There were many stories she had about strange things that happened in the house. Sinks turning on in the middle of the night, noises of footsteps in the attic, motion sensor lights at night turning on when my great-grandma was asleep, with the dog in another room. Also, there were crosses carved above many of the doorways. When they moved in, my aunt helped with some painting and covering the crosses in the process. As they covered them, they heard noises coming from another part of the house. The next day, all the crosses were back. Coincidentally, my mum's boss's son just recently moved into the exact same house 15 years later, and she was telling my mum about her son's haunted house before ever being told that my grandma and great-grandma had actually lived there previously. This happened about 7-ish years ago, when I was 17 and living independently for the first time since leaving the local children's home. The building I lived in was a very old stone cottage that was once used as a pigsty before being converted. On a caravan site that used to be a farm, the place was always freezing cold and always had a weird vibe about it. And a bunch of odd things happened there, but this was the main thing that stuck with me by far. At some point while living there, probably around the 6-month mark, I lost my keys. It didn't matter to me much, because it was so out in the sticks in rural Wales, UK, that I felt I could confidently leave it unlocked, with no bother, and I was able to get spare keys for the other ones that were on the ring. While not being too worried or thinking that finding them was very urgent, I did search the place from top to bottom several times over the next 7 to 8 months, but never found them, nor did I come across them when I organized cupboards, drawers, or moved furniture around. They were completely gone. One morning I woke up around 10ish and came straight through to the kitchen. The place was a long rectangle with 4 rooms in a row from right to left, bedroom, kitchen, bathroom, and a tiny hallway with front door, living room to make myself a coffee as usual. And there, right in the middle of the kitchen counter in front of the coffee pot and the kettle, as if I had just left them there the night before, were my keys. As you can imagine, I was floored by the perceived nonchalance these inanimate objects were just sitting there with, and instantly my thoughts turned to sleepwalking, downright forgetfulness, etc. But I knew in the back of my mind that none of these explained it. I went to grab them, and instantly dropped them because of the searing pain in my hand. They were hot, like metal baking trays straight out the oven hot, like they had been sitting under the sun on a corrugated metal roof all day in high summer heat. I made myself coffee, making sure not to touch them, and left them there all day and eventually picked them up and hung them on the hook next to the door, and didn't lose them again. Some other strange things that happened are as follows. I would sometimes hear a woman crying outside my window during winter, when there were no guests staying in the caravan or camping section of the park, which was in a different field anyway. Repeatedly, I'd wake up to find a suited man sitting on the end of my bed in the middle of the night. I'm not sure if it was a dream, but it never felt like one. Doors kept opening and closing that I knew were not opened or closed beforehand. Wardrobes being opened and things being dragged out of it while I was out of the room. This happened a lot, no matter how many things I stacked in there. The door on it was one of those that you had to push inward for it to release the catch and open outward, if you get what I mean. The TV would turn itself on and off, flickering lights and bulbs breaking way more than normal. Extra cold and hot spots throughout the building, which I often walked through or felt forming and disappearing next to me. I used to sleep with an electric blanket under my bottom sheet and 2 or 3 blankets on top of me, and occasionally would wake up freezing with 1 or 2 of the top layers on the other side of the bedroom. There was no way I could have kicked them that far in my sleep. Once I woke up with my bed a foot away from the wall. It was a divan bed with wheels. We are not in an area that experiences earthquakes or anything like that, so how did it move? I moved out when I was 17 and social services don't put kids there anymore due to some unrelated issues that I had with the landowner, which I am glad about in many respects. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask in the comments. My parents' second house had some oddities in the first year or so after we moved in. All but one event happened to my mother. This one was the first to happen, which my dad also witnessed. That is, if you count hearing something as witnessing it. We had a shop vac purchased atop a freestanding shelf in the laundry room. Now, the laundry room was directly next to my parents' bedroom, in such a way that the washer and dryer were directly on the other side of the wall from their bed. Exactly how we had the washer, dryer, and shelves arranged, I don't know, because shortly after this we took apart the shelves and stored them somewhere else for unrelated reasons. However, the shop vac was atop it, and the washing machine was somewhere nearby. My mother usually keeps the lid to the washing machine open at night to let it air out. My parents heard this crash one night as they were falling asleep. It sounded like it was in the laundry room, so they went to check it out. The shop vac had somehow managed to land in the washing machine. Now, it was positioned on the shelf in such a way there was no way for it to be able to fall off, and everything was pretty stable. There was no angle or anything that would cause it to slide off, and I know this because they tested it and tried to place it on the shelf in such a way that it would become unstable, but that never happened. This was the only poltergeist activity to occur. My mother often sleeps in the living room couch. The living room of the house is situated in such a way that my bedroom and the spare room are off on one wall, and the doorway to the rest of the house, including the bathroom, is on the other. One night, my mother heard me walking across the living room, presumably to go to the bathroom, except that I wasn't walking across the room, but it sounded like I was going in circles around the rocking chair that's near the entrance to the hallway. My mother called my name, asking what I was doing. She got no answer. She kept calling my name, becoming increasingly frustrated with me because I didn't say anything. Eventually, she turned on the light. Nothing was there. She checked on me, and I was asleep. On another occasion, my mother felt footsteps behind the couch. The couch wasn't up against the wall, and there was a walkable-sized area between the back of the couch and the front window. The thing is, she didn't hear the footsteps, only felt the weight of some of the pacing back and forth. She said, Can you stop it? I'm trying to sleep." And the footsteps stopped. My grandma called one day and said, "Did you call me a minute ago?" My mum hadn't. Grandma then continued to explain how she'd just gotten a call from us, and when she answered, no one was on the other end of the line. However, she could hear everything that was happening in the house. My dad was watching TV, my mother was vacuuming the rug, and both of my parents were arguing over something at the same time. She could also hear me playing whatever computer game I was into at the time, probably Warcraft 3. On top of all this, she said she heard a sound that sounded like paper being folded right next to the phone. Now, I've delved pretty deep into the creepy, spooky Ask Reddit collection, and I've seen other stories of old phone calls that involve fabric folding noises happening in the foreground. The strangest part of this is that it just happened to occur on the exact same day that my mother's aunt died. This next story is the only one to take place within the last few years of my family living there, instead of the first. I had woken up before, though I cannot say how many times, by the voice of a little girl saying, "Hello?" I usually thought nothing of it, attributing to the random nonsense generated by my brain while sleeping. The thing is, on the few occasions that it occurred, the voice was the same. None of it was relevant to the dream, and it always woke me up. Then, one night, it giggled, sort of like a heh, two abrupt notes, the second being slightly higher pitched than the first. The kicker is, I wasn't really asleep for that one. I was trying restlessly to fall asleep, but had not gotten to it yet. It's on my bucket list now to see a ghost, but as of yet, I've only ever heard one. This final story takes place on the last week that we would be living in the house, and my mother was cleaning the baseboards in the kitchen, as she always had done many times before. By baseboards, I mean these metal heating vents that rely on propane. While my mum was cleaning, she came across a piece of paper. She figured that it must have been something that recently fell back there, as had happened on occasion, since the place where we kept business cards and such was right next to this spot. She pulls it out, and it's a picture of the previous owners of the house with some other relatives of theirs. I think it was their cousins or something. My mum found this odd, considering how she'd cleaned back there for 9 years at this point, and only ever found this picture within the last week of living there. She gave it to the previous owners, who were at the time living next door. They, of course, gave her context to the photo, and that there was nothing unusual about it. It was just a picture of them next to some relative. Before you ask, no, the photo had not been taken after we moved in. That perhaps would have convinced me. But the fact that there was nothing spooky about the photo itself leaves me somewhat skeptical. Still, my mother thought it was the spirit's way of saying goodbye. There's actually a bonus story. My mother used to work part-time as a substitute lunch monitor at a school that was near where we used to live before moving into the house mentioned prior. She used to commute to the school by walking near the entire length of a massive cemetery. Technically, it was more than one, right next to each other. She would travel from its northeast corner into the school near the southwest one. Anyway, the story is that during one of her commutes, she found the entire ground to be black with crows. They were everywhere as far as you can see. My mum didn't think much of this, as they mostly just hopped out of her way as she walked down the road. What she didn't think about till later was the fact that not a single one of them was making a sound. On a different day, she was walking through the exact same cemetery in early spring, when she noticed a young girl in the distance wearing a dress. She found it upsetting that someone would leave their child unattended in a cemetery, in clothing very inappropriate for the weather. We later found out from someone who knows the story better that the girl is called Annabelle, and that she is commonly seen around crows. In fact, if anyone else is familiar with this particular spirit, I'd like to know more. I've been unable to find anything, other than the fact that she occasionally takes rides in the backseat of people's cars. As a child at the age of 4, my family moved into a newly constructed house in the middle of Tennessee, and this is where my first contact with entities happened. One of the first nights I was there, I will always remember walking into my parents' walk-in closet. As I walked in, I felt a cool and refreshing wind blow over me, and saw an entity that looked like a man made of TV static standing at the doorway to the attic. I felt completely at peace and happy. However, I ended up passing out in the closet and pissing all over my mum's shoes. Later on, as I grew to be about 14, I saw a burnt face and manacled hands floating around my room by the door. I remember thinking that the thing hated me and everything about me, and the intensity of its malevolence made me pass out. The next day, I would walk through the area where the entity appeared, and occasionally see it from the corner of my eye. I would routinely see shadows moving out of the corner of my eye, of men in big hats and cats and dogs. One day I saw these shadows, and all of a sudden my sister screamed bloody murder. I ran into their room and saw movement out of my peripherals fleeing. My sister said that a big cat, not our cat, jumped on her and pinned her down. Both my sisters saw it. One day when I was babysitting my sisters, the brand new oven that we had suddenly locked and caught fire within, and it wasn't responding to button inputs or anything. The fire alarm went off and I called my dad to come home, and he turned off the gas under the oven. There was no explanation for the oven incident whatsoever. My friend, who was local, told me that the site of our house had 3 older houses before that had all burnt down in that one spot. Strange occurrences continued at the house, doors opening and shutting. My sister told me recently that after I'd left for the military, she saw a face out the window while she was reading on her phone. Lightning flash and the silhouette of a ladder falling. Then a mangled face pressed onto the screen of the window. The basement where I moved to as a 16-year-old was also a weird environment. I once dreamed that the walls were closing in and ran upstairs in my dreams to wake up on the couch upstairs. My best friend and I, under no influence of drugs, also simultaneously hallucinated that we were at a McDonald's. The basement seems to always amplify hysteria and cause people to act out of character. At a party for high school students we threw, a normally mild-mannered kid freaked out for no apparent reason, punched a pregnant classmate, and also I had a scary dream about my grandpa being a giant in my basement laughing at me. The next day, I found out he had died that night. I dreaded visiting my parents at this point because of the house. While they were very kind and loving when I was younger, by my teens they had become abusive narcissists and boundary-crossing maniacs, and quite frankly I was worried about them both. My father, a formerly devout Christian, had been visiting spirit mediums, which I found out through a reliable source. They also refused to admit our house is haunted. And that's simply the house. I also had a crazy Ouija board experience in high school. Me and a group of friends went to the oldest building at school and began playing. I was skeptical about the whole process, and although a few crazy things happened, the thing that really blew my mind is as the session was coming to a close, it spells out, "Brandon says hi from hell." As soon as it spelled that out, my friend whipped her hand off the planchette and started crying. Apparently, that was the name of her dead brother. Bear in mind, no one, not a soul, had even known about Brandon's existence before this session. We got to say goodbye, and that was the end of it. After that, strange events started happening to all of us. With everything that I'd seen in my house, and now everything that was about to come, I definitely feel like I was cursed somehow. I even went to a friend's dad's girlfriend's who used incense and tried to bless us, but she says that the evil she sensed was intense. Let me tell you, the next 3 years I was arrested 3 times, went to jail twice, was suspended from high school, kicked out of college, almost died in a car accident, and was forced to join the Navy to avoid criminal charges. And although the intensity in my life has died down a lot since then, I often feel followed and watched, and see dead cats out of the corner of my eyes too. I wonder, for real, if I am cursed. I used to live in a heritage house in the Philippines growing up. Heritage houses, for those unaware, are like really, really old and still functioning houses, most from the 17 to early 1900s. While most have been converted into museums, my family had lived in one for generations. Now this house had seen 2 world wars and was once used as a makeshift hospital to treat wounded soldiers during these wars. So I don't really know where to start. On some nights you could distinctly smell gunpowder and rusting iron, as well as burning tires around the house, but the smell would disappear as soon as you leave the front door. On other nights, you'd get the occasional footsteps or random windows opening or closing, with no explanation whatsoever. But the strangest and the most real experience for me was when I had some of my friends over. We just entered high school, which now is the equivalent of middle school first year, and we were telling each other jokes around the living room. When I kid you not, we hear a basketball dribbling from inside the house. I've now grown used to unexplained noises, but my friends decide to investigate. Lo and behold, we see a basketball roll by the dining room into the kitchen. Then we heard it dribbling again, by itself. One of my friends who investigated said he legit saw it bounce up and down, so they got really scared and went home. I followed them because peer pressure, and after that, they refused to hang out at my place. I told this story to my mum, and the next thing I know, there's a shaman in my house spreading salt all over the dining room floor.
Before I was born, my parents decided to move to the coast and open their own little seaside hotel. The first thing to do when they moved is to clean all the rooms, so they took half each to speed things up. My mum told me this story when I was little. She was in a certain room cleaning, doing some vacuuming, when the whole carpet started rippling. When I was little, I didn't think it sounded scary at all. I just thought maybe it had been caught on a carpet or something, so never really thought about it again. Fast forward about a month ago, I remembered this old story and made fun of my mum for thinking it was creepy, when it was obviously explainable. She looked confused and told me I must not have understood her when I was little. Apparently what had actually happened was that the entire carpet had rippled in a constant fluid wave motion, and that all the furniture and herself had been lifted up and down off the ground for about 10 seconds. She then screamed bloody murder at my dad down the hallway and told him they were selling the place before it had even opened. He managed to convince her otherwise, but she had never since gone back to that room. It scares me because my mum doesn't believe in the supernatural or anything like that, and doesn't have another creepy story at all, just this one that she doesn't like to talk about.
I was still living at my dad's house when I was 17. It started the day we visited the house. I just got chills thinking about it. We were doing a house tour with the property seller from a company where my dad told me, "This is going to be your room." As soon as I entered, I knew I would never sleep there. I had that weird feeling like, no way am I going to sleep there. Finally, my dad bought the house. The first night I slept in that particular room, and I actually hadn't been able to sleep. I wasn't believing in ghosts, not sure if I still do, but there was something about this room I just wasn't able to explain, like a very strong bad feeling. I'm not someone who's ever been scared by this kind of stuff. The day after, I told my dad I would never sleep in that room again, and he saw I was dead serious. He knew I wasn't the kind of guy to care about this stuff, but actually, I did at the time. So he decided to build me a new room in this huge basement, like new walls and stuff. The room didn't even exist before we built it. A week or two went by, and then I started to hear voices in my imagination. It was just so strange. Then I started to hear an unmistakable knocking, softly on the walls for no reason, and doors that I knew were closed would open when I went to the bathroom at night. I told my dad, and he started to make fun of me by opening doors and knocking on the basement door, saying it wasn't him. My best friend came over, and he felt something strange too, and didn't want to come back to sleep even after when he was drunk. He was telling me things like, No way am I sleeping in that basement again. After a month or so, I started getting sleep paralysis on a weekly basis. Scared the hell out of me. Never saw anything more than my empty room though. Actually, I never saw anything. Always strange feelings and doors that had been opened, and creepy voices in my head. I was a serious hockey player with no drugs or mental problems. And one day I was at my girlfriend's house and was talking to her about it. Her mum heard some of what I was saying and came immediately. She was some kind of medium and stuff. She listened to me and told me she would come and see what was going on. It's after that discussion I started really getting scared because I was more convinced there was a physical reasoning behind it all. She came and I'll always remember the look she gave me. She immediately got out and told me there's one guy who's not happy and he carries a very heavy weight on his foot, and there's another guy who only wants to make jokes. I'll take care of that. She also told me some of the things that were happening in the house without me having told it to anyone. And from that moment on, nothing ever happened again. I asked her what she did, and she explained that she went to my bedroom, made them come to her, and then took them away from the house. I know it's weird, but the fact that nothing ever happened again creeps me out too. I'd like to add to the fact that I did some research afterwards. There was only one owner before my dad, and he confirmed that he built the house and nothing tragic ever happened there. I would also like to add that I'm French. So, you know, like from the moment she left the house and did her thing, nothing ever happened again. No sleep paralysis, no voice, no doors, no shaking, no knocking, no nothing. It still creeps me out just thinking about it. My dad lived in an Art Deco house from the 30s in the UK. It was rather cool looking. There were pictures of me and my sister over the mantelpiece. He would always say about how the pictures would be facing the wrong way. Convinced he had them facing the right way. I had seen the pictures facing the wrong way a few times, but was pretty sure he was playing a trick on me, just to try and spook me. Years pass and he has moved. I've gone into work as a builder and doing some work for a lady and having a chat. Turns out her daughter had recently moved into the street my dad used to live on. Not only that, but it turns out to be the same house. I say it's a cool looking house, and she agrees, and in her words she goes, "Yes, it's a good looking house with a lot of character," but she complains because the pictures keep turning themselves around. I was gobsmacked. Maybe my dad wasn't doing it after all, and there was something there that didn't want to see the faces in the photos. When I still lived with my parents, I experienced some weird things. My room was in the basement, and I remember a couple of times that I heard footsteps upstairs, but when I went to investigate, I found myself home alone. I remember one night when I heard someone come down the stairs. A few moments later, there was a door opening somewhere. I called out but received no answer, and I asked my parents about it the following morning, but they had all been fast asleep upstairs the entire night. I've also heard faint and short whispers at times, but I usually just dismissed it as random noise emitted by an old wooden house. The thing that freaked me out the most, however, was that one time I saw a shadow in the middle of a corridor, not up against a wall. I've caught glimpses of shadows and movement from the corner of my eye at times, but I usually dismiss it as some hair that got stuck in the corner of my eye, or me just being tired in general. This one time, however, I was walking down the hallway towards the bathroom where there was a shadow that flashed and then disappeared right in the middle of the hallway, just a couple of feet away from me. It was gone in less than a second, but it had not been in the corner of my eye. It had been in the center of the hallway and the center of my field of vision. It was over so fast, but it was definitely the shadow of a person wearing a long dress. I moved out of the house almost 2 years ago, and haven't had anything remotely similar occur to me since. The house I lived in was haunted. Best I give you some history. I was a kid when I first moved in, and lived there for over 15 years. I moved out for reasons unrelated to anything. My mum bought this house from the original owners who had built it. The original owners had one daughter who worked for a famous politician. She met an unfortunate end that people find shady. The parents moved somewhere else after losing their only child, and eventually had the house I lived in built. Not sure how long they lived there, but we bought it and they moved into a nursing home. Soon after I moved in, I would hear what sounded like a little girl saying, "Hey," exactly like someone just trying to get someone's attention. I would be in my bedroom, and it sounded like it was coming from the front door. I go to the front door and no one was ever there. This was also in the middle of the day. The only children I remember wouldn't have been babies, or not even been born yet when this happened. It happened repeatedly a few times a day, on and off. My family is Buddhist, and we got a family friend to set up some shrines to protect us. The haze stopped, and all was well for a while. We never stopped having those shrines, and they're still there despite more things eventually happening. My house is oddly long. Family room/basement door is on one side of the house, followed by the kitchen, living room, and then bedroom areas. Only my mum and I lived there for quite a time. One day I was home alone and heard the distinct sound of someone going up the stairs. The door to come up, opening and closing, and footsteps walking towards the bedroom. I was in my bedroom, which is the first one after that stretch of the house. I wasn't spooked, as I really did think it was my mum coming home in the afternoon, but no one was there at all. Years went by, and my then boyfriend, now fiancé, moved in for a bit. As a heads up, he's had paranormal stuff happen to him previously. He got the middle guest room. The following will be his experiences. One of my ugly dolls was in his room, on his bed. He wasn't a fan of it and put it on the floor one day. When he woke up next morning, it was back on the bed next to him. Neither my mum or I moved that doll. That long stretch from the bedroom to the other side of the house, he never liked it. Felt like he was being watched and not by anything good. I'd also like to add that I was always rushed through that hallway at night, with lights on if I had to. So we were never fans of that walk. It got better when we adopted 3 cats, who mainly stayed in the family room on the other side, like they formed a bridge between the 2 areas. One day he came home from work one morning, 3rd shift, and noticed the lights behind my mum's bedroom would turn on by themselves. They didn't have any motion or timer. My mum was at work. I have also seen a door that was open later be closed without anyone around, but I didn't witness the act itself. Another thing I heard a few times was the sound of a bouncing ball outside my house. This was years ago, so I can't recall what kind of ball it sounded like, but imagine a kid just bouncing a ball on concrete repeatedly nearby. But it was only in the middle of the night, and there is no hard surface near that corner of the house, just grass and dirt. The driveway is on the whole other side of the house. So the house now has 3 people. One day, due to work and travel, I was home alone. I was in my room and heard a very distinct knock on my closed door. From the rhythm to the volume, it sounded exactly like how my mum would playfully knock on my door to get my attention. 3 lightish knocks in quick succession. I remember being very, very scared about this because whatever it was imitating my mum. I did a lot of praying for protection that night. Finally, we arrive at the last incident. If you notice, everything I had experienced had either been something that changed but I didn't witness, or something audible. This was my first visual experience. This happened with my mum and dad in the house at night. My fiancé had moved out by then. My dad was in the kitchen cooking for the next day. My mom was in the guest room, and I was in my own room laying on the floor on my stomach on my laptop. My actual computer desk is so full of crap, I chose the floor. I was turned away from the entrance with the door to the right of my feet from my point of view. The door was closed, the lights were on, and in the reflection of my laptop monitor I saw someone pass from left to right, with the lights behind me and seeing from the display that's on, I can't say I saw any details, but the lights were interrupted by a figure walking past, like someone was going from the door to my room and passing the lights. The way the reflection looked seemed something out of the ordinary, and I thought it was my mum messing with me. I quickly turned around, but naturally no one was there in the room with me. The door was still shut, and no one could have opened the door, walked back and forth and left that quickly and quietly. I immediately checked on my mum in the room right next to me. I had to eliminate any doubt, even with the unnatural speed a human wouldn't had time to sneak out. She was on the bed with blankets, a lap desk, a laptop, and busy as a bee. No way my dad could have done anything like that. He's old and not quiet. So that was my second fearful incident. I'm not gonna lie, I did not feel comfortable sleeping in my room for quite a while after that. Just the culmination of all of this was getting freaky for me. We went to a Buddhist temple to get some stuff done. I was planning on moving out soon, and didn't want whatever this was following me. So far, so good. Despite my mum having her fair share of ghostly experiences in her home country when she was a youngster, she never experienced anything in this house. My dad as well. We actually didn't want to tell him any of this as we didn't want to spook him. In summary, I feel like maybe the beginning may have had something to do with the daughter of the original homeowners, although she never lived here and definitely wasn't a little girl when she passed. It's like she was looking for where her parents lived last. I don't know. Maybe she regressed to a more innocent time of her life with her child's voice. As for the rest, I have no idea. I'm just happy that I'm not feeling that fear anymore. Thanksgiving is about a month after my birthday. When I was 2, my brother Patrick was about 5 months old. My father Pat and mother Sally were invited to have Thanksgiving with friends, a young couple, Alice Ann and Frank Nudler. As the Nudlers were young and had yet to start a family, they didn't have much money. They had recently rented an old Victorian house just outside of town, an hour or two from Wichita, Kansas. They had rented it for a much lower price than it should have been on the market, so they felt very lucky to have gotten such a large house at that price. They had not been living there for more than a month. As the house was large and somewhat drafty, Alice Ann and Frank had decided to live downstairs, using only the kitchen, living room, parlor, and old servant's bedroom off the kitchen. They spent most of their time in the kitchen to stay warm, but had set up the dining room and parlor to accommodate their guests for Thanksgiving. When Pat and Sally arrived, they both commented on how gothic and large this old house was. It seemed strange for their young friends to be living there, but they shrugged it off and headed to the door. They were warmly greeted by their good friends and immediately began to socialize and settle in for the evening of festivity. It had begun to snow, so a cheery fire was put up in the parlor. After a bit, my brother and I were put down for a nap in the small servant's room off the kitchen. Pat and Alice Ann had drifted off into the parlor and were sitting and talking while Frank and Sally were in the kitchen doing minor preparations for their dinner. They were all having a lovely time, flirting and talking as young couples do, when Pat thought he saw someone out of the corner of his eye walk across the living room just outside the parlor. He casually asked Alice Ann if there was anyone else who had been invited to dinner. Alice Ann looked a bit confused and said, "No, why do you ask?" He replied that he thought he just saw a man in the living room. Alice Ann was quiet for a moment and looked perturbed but murmured, No one else." As the afternoon wore on, the snow became quite heavy, and Alice Ann suggested that Pat and Sally stay the night to avoid driving home through a snowstorm. They had 5 bedrooms upstairs after all, so there was plenty of room. The house was partially furnished, and all the rooms had beds, so they agreed. It would probably be best to stay and leave in the morning, they thought. After dinner, Alice Ann handed Pat a set of old skeleton keys and told him the room upstairs were always kept locked. She suggested that they go up and select a room for his small but growing family. Pat thought it was a bit odd that the doors were locked, but thought probably the landlord had stipulated this for rental agreement purposes. So shrugging his shoulders, he climbed the stairs to the second floor. The stairs ended in a small landing, and as you turned to face a narrow, long and dark hallway with 2 bedrooms on each side or other end, the first thing he noticed was the abrupt drop in temperature as he ascended. He didn't think too much about it, as it was snowing, after all, and there was no heat or fires lit upstairs. It did seem to be extraordinarily cold, though. He shivered and moved down the hall and began to open the doors upstairs. He thought that he would open each room and allow his beautiful wife Sally to pick the room she wanted. He intended to leave the doors open to allow some heat to penetrate before having her come up to select the room. As he moved around, he felt an odd prickling feeling, as though he were being watched. He shrugged it off and laughed to himself quietly, as he thought he was just scaring himself. As he opened the last door, he headed for the stairs and had just stepped down a stair or two when behind him he heard a slow creak, followed by the sound of a door closing with a click. He slowly turned to see the first door closed and the second door creaking closed with another click, followed by the third and the fourth and the fifth. He stood there for a moment trying to rationalize what he had just seen and heard. He decided there must be a draft, or the house being old might be causing the doors to close. So back up he went to reopen the doors, only to find that they were all locked again. Feeling somewhat bewildered, he rationalized, thinking it must be something to do with the age of the house and how the doors worked. He began unlocking them all over again, opening them and moving them back and forth to see how they would close on their own, but they seemed perfectly fine. Shrugging his shoulders, he finished opening them and again began to descend the stairs, only to hear another creak and slam. This time, the doors were closing with a bit more force, much harder and louder. He froze on the stairs and watched the remaining doors creak closed with a slam one by one. At this point, he decided it would be best to come back with Sally to pick a room. He felt discomfort and a bit unsure to why this was happening, but decided to say nothing. Well, what could he even say? He didn't want to sound silly, nor did he want to scare his wife. When it was time to retire to bed, Pat gathered his sleepy children and his wife and headed up the stairs with some misgivings, but didn't say a thing. He unlocked and opened several doors, and Sally chose the room closest to the stairs. After closing and locking the other rooms, they made their way in to dress for bed. Pat prepared the pallet on the floor next to his side of the bed for 2-year-old me and my brother Patrick. Patrick was nestled in his bassinet on Sally's side, and after bundling everyone in and making sure we were all warm and as comfortable as possible under the circumstances, the lamp on the side of the bed was turned off and they all drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, around 3 a.m., Pat awoke to hear a toddler giggling and the pitter-patter of tiny feet running around the room. Assuming it was little me, he said quietly but firmly, so as not to wake the wife or boy, "Maeve Lynn, get back to bed." It was then that he noticed how very cold the room was. It seemed an otherworldly kind of cold, a stilling chill that penetrated your very soul. The sound continued, and he repeated, "Maeve Lynn, get to bed." But hearing no answer, but another quiet giggle and more footfalls, he rose his eyebrow and exasperatedly flicked on the lamp at the side of the bed. That was when he was met with utter shock, because I was there quietly sleeping next to him, snuggled in my blankets. Sally groggily asked what was happening. Pat, feeling stunned and confused as well as shaken, quietly shook his head and told her that he was just checking on me to make sure I was covered okay. Sally immediately rolled over and was sleeping peacefully, almost before he finished his sentence. Pat turned off the lamp and lay there, puzzled, wondering what the hell he just heard. After dwelling on it for a few more minutes, he drifted off and nothing else happened for the rest of the night. In the morning he woke up as the first bit of light crept into the room. He lay there thinking and wondering what had happened in that night. Finally, he shrugged it off as he could not find a rational explanation. However, when he arose from bed, he froze, for there on the dusty old wooden floor were tiny footprints all over the room. They weren't mine, as he had carried me in, already sleeping, and tucked me away into my pallet the night before. Some weeks later, the Nuddlers moved out. They told Pat and Sally the house was too creepy and cold, but later, they admitted that she had heard them too. She had seen the man in the living room, and they had heard strange sounds and cries and screams coming from the rooms above them. It turns out that at the beginning of the 20th century, a family living there, a man and his wife and small children, had all been murdered by an axe in that house. Or so my father tells us. When I researched the murders in the early 20th century in Kansas, I came across a murder that occurred in Atkinson, in which a small family had been murdered and discovered by a family the following evening. However, the house was not Victorian and was far smaller than the house my father described, although he was prone to embellishing his stories, which he did quite well, and to the delight of his listeners, because it always made the story that much better. In summer vacation, I had to spend time with my grandparents for a while. Mind you, their house is in a remote village surrounded by a pretty dense forest. Overall, it just looks sketchy. I figured it wouldn't be any harm me spending some time there, so I just went there, unpacked my things, and started chilling around. First day, no big deal. Second day, all good. Now the third day, different matter. During the day, I had to go get some things from the second floor in order to prepare the food, so I just started going up the stairs. Suddenly I heard some kind of low voice, like a whispering. It sounded completely silent, so I was not able to determine what it was. I just figured it would be the wind, or these kinds of echoes that sound inside our heads sometimes. You get me? I got the things, and down the stairs I went again. Now, that sound got louder. I still couldn't make out what it was, but it sounded every time I went down each stair. So now I was more suspicious. But even then, I just kept minding my own business. Night came and it was time to go to my room, which unfortunately enough was also on the second floor. I had completely forgotten about the sound, and the night was calm. So, this time, no wind or placebo effect could influence what I heard. And what I heard each time was when I took a step up the stairs was an elderly voice saying 1, 2, 3. It freaked me out, and I sprinted my way up the stairs, and so with every step I took, the voice followed me and kept counting of them, at the same speed I was taking them, like encouraging me to go faster. And during that time, two things happened to me. First of all, I noticed that each sound was coming from each stair, which was creepy to say the least. And the second thing was my brain telling me, Adrian, whatever the hell you do, don't look back. Mind you, I've never agreed with something as much as I agreed with that advice, and I'm pretty sure I broke the record for how many stairs can be climbed in the least amount of time by a human being. Thinking about it now, why the hell did there have to be more than 30 stairs in order to get to the second floor? When I got to my room, I inadvertently started counting my heartbeats, in the same way the voice counted the stairs. I loudly and annoyingly swore out loud, paranoid the voice had come into the room, but there was nothing but complete silence surrounding me. I didn't know what to do. Did I call my grandparents or flee the house before some spirit annihilates me while I sleep? Obviously I slept. I slept like a baby with the amount of mental stress the situation had put me under, and all my energy faded away as I fell asleep in moments. But the next day in the morning, if you'd have told me I was scared of going down a few stairs, I would have laughed. But at that moment, it was a matter of life or death. I literally waited for my grandparents to wake up so that I could go down. And although nothing happened, for the rest of the day I was there, it still has left me quite freaked out. I lived in a haunted house. Let me elaborate. The
The house was in Milford, Connecticut. We moved from Connecticut the August before I was in first grade, and to there from Oregon when I was about 2 or 3. All my first memories are in that house. I have an older sister and brother, my brother being 10 years older and my sister 5 years older. My brother was in high school at the time, and my sister elementary. The layout of the house wasn't too odd. You open the front door to a large living room, and to the right, there are stairs to the second level. Also a closet along the wall on the left. You walk through the living room, and on the left is a large fireplace with one full-length mirror, and on the right side facing the fireplace. Next to the fireplace was the hallway that went to my room at the end of the hall. A bathroom on the right side, a basement door on the left, and my parents' door last. Going in the basement, it has the floor space of the main floor, so it was rather large comparatively. Walking down the stairs to the left was the laundry equipment, plenty of room for storage but was never used. On the right side was a TV, coffee table, couch, the usual stuff. Because I was little, I doubted every memory I ever had of that place. I never once trusted myself. But now that I've seen some relatively strange paranormal stuff elsewhere, I've had my numbers read, tarot cards done, palms read, all that touristy fun stuff. They say I'm supposed to have some kind of connection to the other side. I'll let you make your evaluation on that, jokes aside. Anyhow, I was talking to my brother about a month ago. I was looking up the house on Google Maps and wanted the address. He calls me immediately. I know something's going to go down because I've talked to him on the phone maybe 3 times in 25 years. We're close, but would rather not talk on the phone. The first thing he asks me is what I remember about the house. My brother is a cop, so between that and our upbringing, every question is looking for an answer. Every question is loaded with all this extra stuff and implications. It's never just a simple question. So I tell him all the crazy stuff I remember, and it turns out he remembers some of it too. What kind of little kid makes the effort to put sand on the inside of windowsills? The kind that's curious if the people inside the house at night are breaking in. What kind of kid lays ropes, strings, and all kinds of stuff all over the house that would look like laser grid patterns to monsters? The kind that has seen them and is afraid. What 8 to 11-year-old girl won't go to sleep in her room at night and will sleep on the floor of their brother's room? The kind of girl that's forced to sleep there because they're scared out of their wits. Let's get to the stories. There was an occasion where I was taken out of my top bunk and placed gently on the floor with both beds made when I awoke. I remember a bright light from outside my room light up my room, and somehow one of the lights seemed to move me. My dolls would also eventually start moving. A family friend who died of breast cancer about 9 months after I was born had made the effort to find a Cabbage Patch doll that looked exactly like I did. I didn't have any friends. My parents were mostly checked out, so I was alone. I loved that doll with all my heart. It made me feel stupidly crap that I couldn't give my doll life. I thought I wasn't loving him enough, but I knew I was loving him with all I had. Later in life I realized all those moments hurt deeply my self-esteem, and as a result I've never felt like my love was enough. Eventually I obviously figured out dolls aren't supposed to move, but still I always wish that mine would. Sometimes I'd look at the mirror, and I'd see an old lady or man instead of my reflection. I'd walk up to go to the bathroom, and my mum would be having a full-on conversation with someone, but there was no one there. An old lady ghost in the basement was yelling at me to go upstairs because she was busy doing the wash. Watching people freak out when my brother had a sleepover, then you'd never see the kids again. It was a night in particular when I was sitting on the stairs of the basement feeling like a big grown-up kid and watching a movie with my brother and his 3 friends. After the movie, I went upstairs to go to bed. Before I get some water and go to the bathroom. When I was done, I heard my brother yelling for me. So I go down and everyone swears I came down the stairs. So it's lights out, and my brother is talking to me, freaking them out. Then one kid fell asleep, and his feet happened to be in what little moonlight was shining through the little windows, and he starts moving around. So my brother and I start whispering and then stop talking and watch him. He's tossing and turning as if he's pretending to be asleep, his feet still visible in the light. He sits upright and tells my brother to stop touching his feet, and then yells at us. Whichever one of us was touching his feet had the coldest hands he's ever felt. Whilst he's saying this, his foot gets a little tickle. He stops talking and goes white, and tells us that something is touching his foot. But he can see his feet, and there's nothing there. He gets up to see if it's another kid playing a prank, but it isn't. So he calls his parents. And after the kid left, my brother and I are downstairs. One of the other kids says, "Hey, I couldn't sleep and was watching the other guy toss and turn, and there wasn't anyone around." I know he thinks we're messing with him, but there really wasn't anyone. "You guys are over there, and me and the other guy were here trying to sleep. What's up with your house, dude?" None of the kids would ever return to the house again. I once asked my sister about it, and she didn't say anything, just walked away. My parents pulled me aside and told me in no uncertain terms that I should never ask her that again. I'm 40, and they haven't pulled me aside since I was in high school. I don't know what it's about, but it must be some serious PTSD levels of seriousness. My sister slept in my brother's room every night she was able. When she wasn't allowed, she'd sneak out. My brother would set her bedclothes aside and assumed she'd sleep in there. There was a little door to the attic behind my brother's dresser. We didn't use this space either. If you went inside, there was a path that went to a door to my sister's room that opened in her closet. General messes. Things turned on, or worse, would get turned on or off in the middle of dinner, and no one would notice until it was time to eat and nothing was cooked. The first time that happened, I got in trouble for lying. It actually got to a point where I was surprised that other people didn't have ghosts in their home. Being scared was normal. Everyone went through it through childhood. I just happened to be scared all the time. We'd always see apparitions move in and out of the house. Well, I used to set up snares and trap ghosts and monsters, and consume every detective novel and magazine and book, and anything spy to help me learn what was going on. Thinking everything was normal and average, but feeling like it was all wrong. I used to watch a painting move, and was randomly scared of places in my house, even though I couldn't explain. There were cold spots, things being moved, all the regular haunted house stuff. My sister even messed around with a Ouija board, and made stuff worse for a while. Eventually I would just tell the ghost either to be my friend and stick around for a while, or go back to wherever it came from. And that was the last of it. I guess it really didn't want to be my friend. My wife has a background in early childhood education. After we got married, she noticed that I may have ADHD, and potentially some autistic stuff going on. After a psychologist, I went for testing, a lot of it. We met with her, told her what was going on and what kind of testing we wanted, and I requested a schizophrenia test. How else am I seeing and hearing stuff no one else does? Turns out I have a few learning disabilities, which in hindsight is pretty obvious. I'd overachieve in everything but my learning disability areas. For me, it's math and language. As a result, I developed a stutter as a kid, because I didn't know how to communicate things. Stuttering was my way to collect my thoughts about what I wanted to say. Aside from that, I told the doc about everything, and she didn't have any answers for it. At least, in the Connecticut house, I wasn't the only one. We just never talk about it. Ever.
My sister and I were just talking on the phone about some strange things that had happened to us all throughout our time in our childhood home. I mentioned that I thought our home was haunted because our mother had taken a rock from Auschwitz and brought it back home. My working theory is that the rock itself carries energy, or memory, or spirits that are imprinted into the stone because of the horrific trauma within the walls of the concentration camp. My sister and I were sharing stories and experiences that we had, which correlated with the time that the rock had been in our family home, as well as correlated to the movement of the rock from room to room. I am very aware that what my mum did was disrespectful and disturbed some energies. It's just taking a long time to put two and two together about the subject. Anyway, just for reference, we would experience in our house physical pain unrelated to any obvious injury, mental health struggles, and thoughts of ending our own life, unexplainable and unintelligible whispers, shouts, loud bangs, and the like with no discernible cause. Strange sounds coming from underneath the floor in my bedroom, odd lights and anomalies in my sister's bedroom, and just an atmosphere of constant unease and anxiety. Any ideas would be greatly appreciated. We don't know what to go about this, but we definitely want to talk to our mum about having something done to cleanse the house, and doing something with the rock that honors the spirits of the innocent dead, while banishing any lingering spirits connected to it. Please, all suggestions would be appreciated. This is the first time I share anything like this, but I need to get it off my chest because it's been freaking me out for years, and I can't talk to any of my friends about it because they don't believe me. I have a long list of things that have happened to me over the years we've been in the house I currently live in, and I am a 20-year-old college student since the time of this post. The first event I can remember was when I was around 5 or 6. This is shortly after my brother passing away from cancer. I had a babysitter with me, who knew me since just after I was able to walk. I don't remember her much after this event, but she was extremely nice. Anyway, I walked into the entrance area in my house that has stairs going to the upstairs. This area is connected to the dining room, living room and kitchen. I saw a man walking down the stairs with what seemed like a Civil War attire. When he got to the landing and turned to go down the rest of the stairs, he looked me dead in the eyes and moved his mouth like he was talking, but I couldn't hear him. In response, I turned to call my babysitter Emma, and I turned back and he was gone. I don't know what to think of that besides an overactive imagination, but I don't think so. Shortly after this event, Emma quit because she got scared. I don't remember saying this, but according to my parents, I said something along the lines of, "He doesn't like you," and her, before she almost got into a crash a few days later. The second and third events all happened in a 2-year time period. I usually have to bring the Christmas decorations back to the basement in mid-January. It was a normal day and we just boxed all the Christmas tree ornaments, so I had to go and put them in the corner of the basement, where we have random stuff from when my parents first got married to where they first moved into the house after it got built. We put the box down, and as I'm still walking back to the stairs, I heard a faint girl's voice whisper something behind me. My hairs stood on end, and I book it up the stairs and start crying. They don't listen to me since I'm only 10 at the time, and a year comes and goes, and I've steeled myself for this moment, again, thinking I just heard the TV that's directly above me. But again I hear a girl's voice saying something, but this time it was in my ear. The fourth event happens in a very similar way a few years later, since I refused to go to the basement alone. I go down there because I needed to grab something out of the fridge for my dad, and I already didn't want to be down there. Just as I'm leaving, I hear a girl laugh, coming from the corner of the basement, where the other 2 events happened, and one of the pipes starts making a similar noise to a teapot boiling. This was the first and only time this ever happened in the house. The 5th event was from when I was around 13 to 14. It was late at night, and I was sleeping, and I remember when something opened the door to my room and walked in. It didn't make a sound, except when the door opened, and it was a man in his 60s with a cane that had a strange design on the handle. He didn't seem threatening or anything, and he didn't show any emotion. I must have fallen asleep somewhere in that time, because I had my dad come in yelling that I was going to be late for school. After school, I talked to my mum to pick me up after football, and explained it to her, describing the man and his cane. She flipped out because that night her father passed away, and I had never met this man before in my life, so there's no way for me to know what he looks like or his cane that he had for years. She doesn't even have pictures of her father in the house or anywhere that I would be able to find. This last bit, other than the main events happening, I've heard doors and cupboards open and slam shut over the years, when I've been the only one in the house since my parents usually left for work at 8 a.m. and didn't get back until at least 9 or 10. I had a strange experience when I was growing up. I was around 12 and coming up from the basement. I was walking up the first few steps when I turned to my left and see a tall woman the size of the door walking through the basement hallway. She was super thin and literally the size of the door and almost translucent. You can bet I hauled ass up the stairs and didn't go down for literal months and never returned down there by myself again. Then there was the time I was sitting in my bed around 17 or 18. I couldn't sleep and was watching some movies on my laptop. My closet door swung open. Didn't sway or anything, just quickly swung wide open and stopped immediately before hitting the wall. I threw my covers over my face and froze in fear until the morning, and couldn't sleep a wink. It was that traumatic. Then there was the white dog everyone in my family saw at least once running around on the main floor. As far as I knew, the dog was chill. Then there was the baby story. My niece was 2. We, my family and I, were sitting in the living room when all of a sudden she gets a very serious look on her face and stares at the corner of the room where no one is and says, "Baby." She immediately makes a beeline into the corner of the room with a big smile on her face. Then the smile falls and she stops in her tracks and says, "Where'd baby go?" We all look at each other in disbelief and still talk about it to this day. That kid is also super connected to death. She used to remember how she died. My dad was watching Hindenburg footage on a documentary and she saw it and said, "That's how I died. There was so much fire." She was 3 or 4, and then wouldn't answer any more about it. But back to the house. You could always hear doors slamming in the basement if you were quiet in the mornings. One morning, just my dad and I were home, and he said, "You ever just sit here and hear the doors slam downstairs?" So we sat up and listened, and before long we heard one slam. Lastly, my whole family went on vacation one summer, but I stayed because I had to work. I was in the living room watching TV as I refused to sleep upstairs alone. Must have been around 2 a.m, and I hear the shower turn on. I'm crapping myself as I'm walking very slowly to the bottom of the step to see if I'm hearing it right. Then all of a sudden I hear the shower handle squeak and turn off, and then I ran out of that place so fast and stayed with friends until my family returned. It took me about a week to move out into my own place after they returned. It was starting to mess with me mentally. I know the house was haunted. Also, the neighbors that moved in after us, their kid got incredibly sick about a month after moving into the house. The house had passed inspection with flying colors before selling, no mold anywhere, but now there was black mold all of a sudden, and it put the kid in the hospital for days. I mean, I'm not saying the house tried to kill the kid, but I'm not saying that it didn't. An ex of mine had a young son who had a tendency to sit up at night and talk to his friends. No biggie, kids in their imaginations, right? One day the girlfriend and I ordered a pizza, set up a movie, and get the kid washed for bed. He's in his bath and I asked if he was ready to go to sleep, and he said it'd be lonely. I asked why if he said he had his friends. Well, fast forward 30 minutes later, I kill the lights to his bedroom and say goodnight. And he turns to me with the biggest grin ever and says, "He's here, he's back." That's when the doorbell rang, and I just about crapped myself. Turns out it was just the pizza guy.